A man's frantic 911 call leads to a devastating discovery.
Stay with me. Stay with me.
They had no idea why this young mother, who was fine hours ago, all of a sudden she's dead.
We want to see our sister. Please, you guys.
It just didn't add up. Things just were not making sense.
A woman of her age and health doesn't simply drop dead without some sort of explanation.
The investigation into this puzzling homicide will reveal what was really going on behind closed doors.
She was talking really, really strange. She was acting out of character.
It doesn't matter who you are. She gets mad. She just stays quiet.
The investigators learned it wasn't all roses.
Things was not going the right direction.
He was lying to us for one reason or another.
Look at me. Something did happen. It did.
This person is quite callous and heartless and cold.
August 1st, 2021. It's a warm summer Sunday in Rochester, New York.
Rochester is a very special and unique mid-sized city. It's unique in that you still have an urban feel, but there's a lot of trees and a lot of beauty to the area.
Rochester is a multicultural melting pot, many different communities.
We have a pretty sizable immigrant community here in Rochester.
Just before noon, an urgent call comes into 911 dispatchers from 26-year-old Somali native Ahmed Ali, asking for help at his residence in Northwest Rochester.
Is that a house or apartment?
It's a apartment side by side. I mean, up and down. It's a lower apartment.
He had told them that he was locked out of the house. His wife was supposed to be inside.
He is knocking on the door. She is not answering.
And you've tried calling her phone too, and she's not answering?
Yeah, I called.
And she knew you were coming?
Yes.
Finally, Ahmed gets a response from inside the house.
My daughter's looking through the window right now.
Okay, get her to open the door.
You can hear him knocking on doors and windows and trying to instruct his 4-year-old through the door on how to unlock the door.
Where's Mama? She's saying sleeping.
Sleeping?
Yes. She don't usually sleep at this time.
And when Ahmed is finally inside, his worst fears are confirmed.
He's able to get inside the house and then finds Arbai unconscious in the bedroom.
Arbai? 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 She's not waking up.
She's not waking up?
No, she's not waking up. Arbai!
I am sending the paramedics to help her now.
As first responders race to the couple's home, the dispatcher guides an inconsolable Ahmed to try to help his wife.
Ahmed, we need to help her. This is very important.
No.
Stay with me. Stay with me.
Ahmed's wife, 23-year-old Arbai Chavala, was no stranger to hardship.
While her family roots were in Somalia, she spent several years of her childhood in a Kenyan refugee camp. She and her family came to the States as refugees when she was just 6 years old.
April 15, 2004, that's when we landed in the United States. She started school here, graduated high school here. Arbai, she was very socializing individual.
She have one of the good personality, like she's really nice, amazing person.
When you talk to her, she will make you laugh. Even if you're not happy, she will make you happy.
Growing up in the States, Arbai had big dreams for her future.
She had so many plans, so many dreams. Being a police officer, that was one of the dreams she had.
That was her first goal. But then she wanted to be a chef. Like she was training, she was more into that.
Like many other young Muslim women, Arbai also longed to have a family of her own.
the role of the woman in traditional households. They're the ones who raise the children, and the man is out there earning a living.
In the spring of 2016, Arbai met a man who she thought she could have a future with. 26-year-old Ahmed Ali.
Ahmed was a Somalian refugee.
They made a bond in the fact of their cultural similarities and the fact that they practice the same faith.
They struck up a friendly relationship online, which led into a romantic relationship.
She'd say, I want to marry this guy. She thought it was a good guy. And then we say, okay, if that's what you want, then if you feel like he's a good man, so yes, you can go marry him.
The couple tied the knot and wasted no time starting their family.
Within few years of marriage, they had 4 children.
Their first child was a daughter, and then they had twins, and then they had another baby.
But now, first responders are racing to the couple's home after Ahmed found Arbai unresponsive in their bedroom.
Everybody's on the way, but do you think she's beyond any help?
He told the 911 operator that he found his wife in the bedroom and that she was clearly dead.
The dispatcher is still on the phone with Ahmed when the first officer arrives on scene.
You come back here with me? Hey, you gotta let the ambulance check.
The officers go to the back bedroom. They see Ahmed Ali, and he's crying over his wife, who is laying on the floor.
It was somewhat of a chaotic scene. Ahmed was upset, and there was several children that were running around the apartment, and they were clearly upset, crying, not really knowing what was going on.
Hey, let's get these kids, okay? Listen to me. Let's get these kids and take them to the front.
The police try to take control of the scene, try to see if they can render aid to her and try to move him from the situation.
As the officer rallies Ahmed and the children, paramedics make their way into the bedroom to attend to Arbai.
Paramedics attempted to render aid, but they discovered she was deceased.
There is just simply no vital signs at all, and Rigor has set in. That, of course, is a sign that she was beyond any sort of help.
However, a look around the room doesn't reveal any answers for what could have happened to Arbai.
They could not identify any trauma to the body that would determine how, in fact, Arbai died.
There were no signs of a physical struggle or anything like that.
They had no idea why this young mother was fine hours ago, and all of a sudden she's dead.
In August of 2021, Ahmed Ali has just found his wife, Arbai Chavala, deceased inside their home under mysterious circumstances.
What we know at that point is that this is very abnormal. This is not usual.
There was no clear signs of trauma. She was also a 23-year-old woman with no obvious health issues.
The house was cluttered and a little messy, but there was also no sign of struggle or anything like that in the house. There was no sign of forced entry in the house.
A woman of her age and health doesn't simply drop dead without some sort of explanation. Could that explanation have been medical? Sure. Is there any way to determine it right then, on the spot? There's not.
It just didn't add up. Things just were not making sense. Something's just not right here.
Based on the condition of Arbai's body, investigators believe she died sometime the night before.
Rigor mortis had already settled in, and that generally doesn't happen for about 8 to 12 hours after somebody dies.
As police continue processing the crime scene, a crowd has gathered outside the residence.
There was some family showing up as well. So additional officers were called down, to help control the scene.
We want to see our sister, please, you guys.
We understand that.
A slew of family members came to the location and made the scene a very hectic scene.
And we're very sorry, but there's certain rules that we have to follow, okay? And if we don't follow those rules, it could jeopardize the investigation.
The family, of course, was very emotional that she was gone. And as the number of family members at the scene grew and grew, that emotion kept growing, and people were very upset.
They're like, don't go across that tape. I'm like, I don't care. Do whatever you want to do. I just lost it. I just couldn't hold it. So I had to find a way to calm down myself.
I could not imagine how devastating it was to Arbai's family.
I lost my mind. As soon as I saw her, I lost my mind. I lost myself.
Back at the station, investigators from the Major Crimes Division sit down with Arbai's husband, Ahmed.
Ahmed is still emotional, but calm enough now to talk to detectives about his wife.
Are you and her get along well? Do you have a good relationship?
That's when Ahmed makes a shocking admission.
Arbai and Ahmed had been separated for about 2 weeks.
He was not staying at the home. He was staying with family.
And you haven't lived there for at least 2 weeks?
I've been going see them, but after that, since the argument, I haven't been like sleeping.
You slept there and you don't have a key to there?
Yeah, she has both of the keys.
When detectives ask what led to the separation, Ahmed says he and his wife had been under a lot of stress lately.
They had one car that they shared. They had lost that car, so they had really no easy means of transportation.
And so that financial strain really made for a difficult time for the young couple.
On top of that, 3 of their 4 children suffer from health issues.
They had some medical issues that they were dealing with.
They had a lot of appointments, and getting kids to and from those appointments was a struggle.
Ahmed says all the pressure had taken a toll on the marriage, and especially on Arbai.
He thought she was acting weird and that she had been acting different recently.
He told the investigators that he thought that she was going through a period of depression and had a lot of anxiety, and that he even called her family members to express his concerns for her mental health and well-being.
She just, like I said, it doesn't matter who you are. If she gets mad, she just stays quiet. Even if she's wrong and you tell her, hey, this is wrong, she won't, like, why would you do that? She won't give you a response or anything. And then it takes her like 2 days, 3 days to actually come back to normal.
She stays that mad for that long?
She's not mad. It's just like, she won't communicate with you unless you communicate with her. That's it. She won't communicate with you.
But according to Ahmed, he only realized how bad the situation had gotten when he talked to Arbai on the phone the previous evening.
He said she was talking really strange. She was acting out of character.
You had a conversation with her on the phone. She was giggling and everything.
Yes.
Ahmed says he went to the home to check on Arbai around 11 p.m. that night, and something immediately seemed off.
Arbai, you okay?
Yeah, she was like, hi.
Ahmed infers that she was on drugs.
"26-year-old Ahmed Ali has just told Rochester detectives that when he saw his estranged wife, Arbai Chavala, just hours before her death, she was high on marijuana.
Arbai, you okay?
He said she was talking really strange. She was acting out of character.
You could smell the weed when you walked in.
Yeah, she was like high, and like, you know, when you get high, you get like certain moods.
Ahmed told us that he saw some wrappers from some marijuana packaging in the garbage.
Okay. So you saw the blood wrapper in the garbage and said, what the heck?
Yes.
He tells the police that that's unusual for her and doesn't know what's going on. He makes it clear he doesn't have any issue with smoking marijuana, but he thinks it's inappropriate to be doing it in the house with the kids.
He then confronts her about her consumption of marijuana around the children.
What's making you do it? What is it that's making you do it? What's got you into this situation that's making you smoke a blunt?
And she says to him, so what if I have?
She said, why do I care? I was like, it's your choice, you're not your boss.
She's really kind of flippant with him, which definitely angers Ahmed. They argue.
She just just go to your house, on the round. Okay. And then you left? Yes.
He said she was fine, and eventually he left, walked back home, and that was it.
So she was alive when you left?
Yes, she was. Yes, she was.
But the next morning, Ahmed says he became concerned when he couldn't get a hold of Arbai.
All right, and then you call, you get no answer, you text, you get no answer. Then you take a look back over there.
Yeah.
Knocking at nothing.
He sees his children inside and can hear his children crying, but does not see his wife. This is very unusual for her to not respond and to let her kids just kind of be crying without her taking care of them.
My daughter's looking through the window right now.
Great, get her to open the door.
He convinces his daughter to open the door to let him in. When he gets in the house, he goes to the bedroom and finds his wife.
Arbai? Arbai? She's not waking up.
Ahmed's story seems plausible, but it also raises new questions about what actually happened to Arbai.
Now, one of the things that we're thinking of was the marijuana laced with something. We're suffering from a tremendous amount of overdoses everywhere.
And there was actually, some marijuana wrapping and packaging in the garbage, so that did match with what he was saying.
To confirm Ahmed's story, investigators ask him if they can download the data from his cell phone.
He voluntarily gives the investigators his cell phone, then unlocks it for them. Then they download the data, which include location services.
However, investigators aren't ruling out foul play in this case just yet. They return to Arbai and Ahmed's neighborhood to dig deeper into the couple's relationship.
We go from door to door, ask neighbors if there was anything suspicious they had seen.
The investigators spoke to several neighbors, some of which were able to provide them a little bit of insight into the relationship between the two of them. And what we learned is, it wasn't all roses.
There was a witness who told us about an incident where Arbai came running to their house during a domestic dispute to get away from Ahmed.
Ahmed is threatening to kill her and claiming to have a weapon, and he's willing to use it.
A neighbor of 23-year-old Arbai Chavala has just told Rochester detectives that approximately 1 week prior to Arbai's death, he overheard her estranged husband, Ahmed Ali, threatening to kill her.
She ran to the neighbor's house to seek some safety or refuge, and Ahmed chased her over there.
The neighbor brought her inside, shut the door, told him to leave, and at which point he threatened to shoot the neighbor.
Ahmed ended up making verbal threats not only to Arbai but the neighbors as well.
They called the police. It was written up in a domestic incident report and labeled as a harassment in the second degree, which is not even something that they arrested him for. They would have just given him what's called an appearance ticket to appear at a later date on that case.
No gun was ever seen or found, so they believe that was an idle threat at that point.
Back at the station, detectives quickly verify the neighbor's account.
It was on the 22nd of July. In that report, Arbai told officers that she told Ahmed that she wasn't in love with him anymore and she wanted to end their relationship. And as a result of that, Ahmed tried to drag Arbai into the bathroom and sexually assault her. That's why she ran to a neighbor's house.
Apart from that, though, there's not much to suggest a prolonged history of abuse in the marriage.
I remember looking into his criminal history. He didn't have much. He had one arrest for disorderly conduct. That's really like the lowest level here.
Thankfully, police get some more insight when they get a visit from Arbai's brother.
Tell us about your sister's relationship with Ahmed.
Things was not going the right direction. He didn't want to talk about it. Everything looked like it was fine, but behind that, everything wasn't really fine. That was balanced back and forth.
Clearly, she had a good relationship with her family and her brothers, and she wasn't keeping a secret from them. They knew that she was in a bad situation.
She had enough, and she wanted to move out.
She expressed she wasn't in love with him anymore, and she wanted to take her children and stay with family.
Together, Arbai and her brothers made a plan for her and the children to move out of the home on July 31st.
The brothers knew that it had reached the level that they needed to intervene, and they were going to do what brothers do.
They were going to bring her and her children back to their home in Utica, about 2 hours east of Rochester.
Her brothers were going to pick them up on Saturday, the day before she was murdered, and bring them back to Utica so they could be safe.
She was like, I want to make sure I get everything, you know. She wanted to do it in the right way.
Everything was set up already to come and get her.
But at the last minute, Arbai had a change of heart.
She delayed them, said, no, I want to, get things worked out.
Somehow, he find a way to come convince her to stay. We told her not to, but he said he's changed.
Arbai said she wanted to give Ahmed another chance. And so the brothers were a bit frustrated and even fearful for her.
Ahmed said your sister was struggling with depression. Did he ever call you to talk to you about that?
He said, no, he didn't call me, he didn't call my brother. They denied that there was ever this communication about her struggling with mental health or drugs or anything like that.
He flat out said that, if Ahmed said something like that, he was lying about it. They were very suspicious of Ahmed. They did not like Ahmed.
As a part of their investigation into Ahmed, detectives begin sifting through the data from his phone.
At first glance of his phone, it was quite clear that what he was telling us was not true. He was giving us inaccurate information.
Ahmed told investigators that he left the marital home the night before on July 31st and didn't return until approximately 11 in the morning on August 1st.
But according to the location data on Ahmed's phone, that was a lie.
His phone was dramatically different from the timeline that he provided us. He never left the house overnight until 7:18 in the morning.
He's actually there when Arbai is killed.
Detectives scouring Ahmed Ali's phone records have just learned he lied about the time he left his estranged wife, Arbai Chavala's house, on the night of her mysterious death.
His phone was dramatically different from the timeline that he provided us.
So that right away is a huge red flag. They know something's up. Most likely she died in the early morning hours of August 1st. He's saying he was gone before then, but his phone is saying otherwise. He's actually there when Arbai is killed.
he was lying to us for one reason or another. And maybe his culpability is a lot more than we initially had thought.
So after we had all this location data, we used that phone data to go seek out locations that would have video that potentially could show him.
We want to find any potential video footage that can support or refute what the data is telling us.
There's City of Rochester cameras all over the city, and then there's also some private security cameras as well.
A neighbor's house had very high quality video, and we could see Ahmed leaving the house at 7:18 in the morning.
Not the night before, like he claimed.
Then we go and find video from other routes he's taken that confirms where his phone is. And we were able to find several occasions where we found that the story he was telling us was not true.
And when investigators receive the results from Arbai's autopsy, it's even more evident that Ahmed has been lying to them all along.
We learned ultimately that she died from asphyxiation. All of the injuries were more internal and things that could only be discovered during the autopsy process.
The medical examiner was able to look at the muscles in the neck, and there was bleeding into those muscles. Specifically, the blood was cut off from her brain. She wasn't able to get oxygen to her brain.
There are still some questions I have, because when they saw the body laying there, you would think that of their strangulation, there'd be something on the neck. But once they did the autopsy, it was pretty clear.
With strangulation, sometimes the mechanism of injury is very apparent, and sometimes there isn't a visible mechanism. In this case, would be the latter.
Now convinced that Ahmed Ali is responsible for his wife's murder, detectives bring him back in for another round of questioning.
At first, they keep things fairly casual, like they're just checking in on Ahmed. They don't want to make it obvious that he's their top suspect yet.
How you doing? Right. So what's going on, man?
Isn't this crazy?
The first room we were in is a little less intimidating. We actually call it the soft room. He was familiar with it, and we wanted to sort of create a comfort level for him as he was rehashing some of the details from 2 days prior.
He was respectful, he was cooperative. I think that he was still trying to figure out exactly what was going on, if we had actually figured anything out.
No, I just don't want to be here like last time.
No, well, here's the thing, we already know the story. We already know the story. So it's now quicker to go through it. We get our interview done, we can write our report.
They start just by, hey, you know, can you just walk us through the story again? And frankly, he's not giving too much.
Okay. All right. So you get over there. You say you smell the weed before you get in. Then you talk to. Then what happens?
So from there it just went on, and then I'm like, okay, I'm leaving because you locked the door, and that's when I left.
They know he's lying. They just want to make him go through that story again, knowing that some of those details are just not going to match up, obviously, with the evidence.
He had told us a story. He tried to stick to that story despite being confronted with the parts that didn't make sense.
They listen to the story, they ask questions, they kind of lock him in on his timeline that he had provided previously.
Then, detectives confront Ahmed with a surveillance video they've collected.
I want you just to watch this quick. Who's that?
That's me.
Okay. All right. You see the time on it? 7 a.m. on A1, which is Sunday.
They show him video evidence that refutes what he was telling us. Basically, they want to say, here's the evidence that we have. We're trying to get an explanation, and we know that you're lying. And the purpose of that is to maybe let him open up and let him confess.
The investigators then tell Ahmed that the Monroe County medical examiner has determined that Arbai was in fact murdered.
He figured out that somebody killed Arbai.
Okay.
So now we're trying to figure out who killed Arbai.
Okay.
What do you think? What do you think would have killed Arbai?
Who was my husband? Who killed Arbai? I wouldn't know that. I wouldn't know when she died.
At this point, we were giving him irrefutable evidence saying, look, we know that you're lying. We know that this is what happened. Tell us why it happened. He had no real answers.
He's sticking to his story. I didn't touch her. I don't know what happened to her.
You were there for 8 hours. You did not leave. And we know that during that 8 hours, she died. Therefore, even if she wasn't killed, you had to be there when she died.
Why would I want to be there when my wife gets killed? And not just that, on top of that, my kids being in the house as well.
Then Ahmed makes a bizarre comment about he and his estranged wife having sex.
We even had makeup sex and everything. That's why I didn't want to get into that details and stuff.
At what time?
I really don't know the time.
After hours of interrogation and even a move to a different room, detectives still don't feel like they're going to get a confession from Ahmed.
There was times where sometimes we would get pretty aggressive with him. As he continued to deny what truly happened, we started to ratchet up, our intensity with him. To be honest, we were yelling at him at times.
And she was going to leave you. She was going to take the children.
No, I did not know that.
She didn't want to be around you anymore.
She's scared to death of you, and she's told everybody that if anything happens to her, it was you that did it. Now she's dead. Why would we think you did it?
The investigators are getting frustrated, and so they say, hey, we're just going to book you. We know it's a homicide. We know that you lied about your whereabouts. We have evidence to refute your story.
We said, okay, you're going to jail for murder.
You're going to get charged with murder, and you're going to have to go to jail because you won't address this.
Okay, why am I being charged with murder?
Because the evidence says that you're the only person that had the opportunity to murder her.
But before Ahmed is taken to jail, he asks to speak to a detective named Melissa Frasca that he'd met earlier that day.
We thought, let's see how he reacts to a female investigator. Will that make him open up anymore?
I'm not really sure exactly what he wants to say, but I go back into the room and I'm in there with him for probably another hour and a half.
She builds rapport with him, and she gets him to kind of open up to her and go further than he would go with the other investigators, the other detectives.
But Ahmed, look at me. Something did happen. It did, and I can't change that, and you can't change that. That's all I'm saying.
Melissa.
Yes, Ahmed.
This is hard.
Finally, after another long round of questioning, Ahmed starts to crack.
At this point, we start to talk about how people make mistakes. People get into arguments. And he does admit that he was arguing with his wife. And they did have a little shoving match.
Yes, something happened.
After hours of grilling by Rochester police, Ahmed Ali has finally admitted that he got into a physical argument with his estranged wife, Arbaid Shavala, on the night of her death.
He does admit that they did have a little shoving match.
Yes, something happened. Did we get into an argument? Yes, Melissa, we got into an argument. I pushed her, she hit her head on a small gesture thing.
You didn't say you always do this to us!
However, Ahmed insists that Arbaid didn't seem injured after hitting her head.
She was fine.
Nothing happened. She was completely fine.
He says she kind of gets up and comes back toward him.
So now she's mad? She comes back after you?
Mm-hmm, still trying to fight.
Okay.
And I push her to the bed.
And then what happens?
I didn't kill her, Melissa.
Okay, but just tell me what happens next.
That was it. And then after that, I keep pushing her. We got into an argument, going back and forth.
He told me the whole incident was 15 minutes.
But no matter how hard Detective Frasca presses him, Ahmed still won't admit to killing his wife.
At any point did you end up putting your hands around her neck?
No. No.
It was a homicide by asphyxiation. There was trauma and hemorrhaging to the neck area, and that's from him compressing.
He still stuck to the fact that she was allegedly alive when he left.
When I left, she was breathing. Okay. You understand? My wife's breathing. She was okay. She was perfect, healthy, everything.
Investigators do believe Ahmed's claim that the fight over Arbai being high turned physical. But they are convinced it went much further than he would admit.
He said he had to throw her off of him, but I think perhaps that rage just boiled up, and he ended up strangling her to death right there in the bedroom.
And the fact that he left his children in a home with their mother dead is quite callous and heartless and cold. He was more concerned about establishing his alibi than worrying about the safety and well-being of his children.
Investigators now surmise that Ahmed's behavior at the crime scene was all an act.
He turned on the hysterics when police arrived on the scene and tried to convince them he was heartbroken by her death, when really he was the killer.
Regardless, Ahmed still won't admit to killing his wife.
I'm trying to tell you, I love my wife dearly. Dearly. Out of anybody. She's not the most beautiful woman in the world. Out of anybody, I chose her to be with her, have kids with her. There's a lot of women that are 10 times prettier than her. I couldn't be with her, but I chose to be with her.
After his interrogation, Ahmed is booked into jail on second-degree murder charges.
That's the most common murder charge in New York. In order to have a murder in the first degree, there's different factors that come into play that elevates the crime.
He is arraigned the next morning. He's held without bail.
But Ahmed's case will never go to trial.
The defense realized that this would be a tough case for them, that there was strong evidence that Ahmed was involved and was looking to potentially take a plea.
To avoid the risk of a life sentence, Ahmed's attorneys strike up a deal with the state.
We extended an offer of a manslaughter in the first-degree plea. As part of his plea, he had to admit that he killed his wife.
He was then sentenced to 22 years.
Because he's not an official U.S. citizen, Ahmed might not be permitted to continue living in the United States after serving his sentence.
No one knows what's going to happen in 20 years with the government and the rules, but we assume he will be deported.
The only thing that I want him to say was just, I'm sorry. I told him that I forgive you for what you did, because even if I'm mad or angry, that's not gonna bring my sister back. She's gone.
I thank everyone in the police department and in the DA office. We thank them. Send them my message of appreciation of the hard work they did to make sure Arbai get justice. I still remember them. I never forgotten them.
I just wish this never happened. I wish this woman is alive for these 4 young children. If you have the right kind of help, you can get through this and have a good life.
Arbai, she was really a good person, and she had a beautiful heart. Her personality is type of person like who love forgiving others. But in any relationship, once you get physical, it's better just walk away before I
What happened to 9-year-old Christine Jessup after she stepped off the school bus on October 3rd, SIL 1984? That question would haunt a Canadian family for more than 3 decades, survive a wrongful conviction, trigger one of the country's most notorious miscarriages of justice, and finally led investigators into the strange new world of genetic genealogy. It began like an ordinary afternoon in Queensville, Ontario. Christine came home from school. She dropped off her school bag. She had plans to meet a friend at a nearby park. Nothing about that afternoon should have suggested that her life was about to disappear from the ordinary world. But Christine never made it to the park. She vanished. At first, the disappearance created fear. Then came the search. Neighbors looked. Police investigated. Family members hoped she would be found alive. Hours became days. Days became weeks. The case quickly became one of those stories that grips an entire community because the victim was a child and because the circumstances seemed impossible to understand. Christine had not simply wandered away. She had disappeared after arriving home. Her family had no idea where she had gone. Investigators needed to determine who had seen her, where she might have gone, and whether someone had taken her. Every minute mattered. But the search stretched on. Then, more than 3 months after Christine disappeared, the investigation took its darkest turn. On December 31st, her body was found in a farmer's field near Sunderland, Ontario, roughly 55 kilometers from her home. The little girl who had vanished in October was dead. The case was no longer a missing child investigation. It was a homicide. Christine had been sexually assaulted and stabbed. The discovery devastated her family and shocked the community. But what followed would become almost as disturbing as the murder itself. Investigators needed a suspect, and eventually suspicion fell on Christine's neighbor. Guy Paul Morin lived nearby. He became the focus of an investigation that would eventually lead to his arrest, conviction, and imprisonment. But the evidence against him would later collapse. DNA testing would ultimately establish that Morin was not the source of the biological evidence connected to Christine's murder. In 1995, his conviction was overturned. He had spent years living under the shadow of a crime he did not commit. The case had now produced 2 tragedies. Christine was dead. An innocent man had been wrongly convicted, and the real killer remained free. For the Jessup family, there was no satisfying ending. There was only another question. If Guy Paul Morin had not killed Christine, then who had? That question remained unanswered for years. Technology continued to evolve. DNA evidence became increasingly powerful. Investigators eventually had biological material recovered from Christine's clothing, including a semen stain containing a DNA profile. But a DNA profile is not automatically a name. If the person responsible is not already represented in a criminal database, investigators can still be left with an unidentified genetic signature. That was the barrier facing the Christine Jessup investigation. The evidence existed. The identity did not. Years passed. The case became one of Canada's most haunting cold cases. Christine's family carried the loss. Guy Paul Morin carried the consequences of a wrongful conviction. Investigators carried the unanswered question. And somewhere in the background was the biological evidence left by the person police now believed had murdered Christine. Then forensic science entered another era. Genetic genealogy offered investigators a different way to search for an unknown suspect. Instead of asking only whether the DNA matched someone already known to law enforcement, investigators could search for potential relatives and reconstruct family relationships. It was a method that had already transformed other cold cases. Now, it was being applied to Christine's murder. Toronto police worked with specialists to analyze the DNA evidence. The investigation began to move through family trees and genetic relationships. Potential relatives emerged, names were examined, histories were reviewed, and eventually, one name began to stand out: Calvin Hoover. He had been 28 years old in 1984. More importantly, he was not a complete stranger to the Jessup family. He was known to them. His wife had a connection to Christine's mother. The families had social contact. The children knew one another. The man investigators were now examining was not some mysterious stranger from another city. He had existed within the family's wider circle. That revelation changed the emotional dimension of the case. For decades, the killer had been imagined as an unknown figure. Now, investigators were looking at someone who had been close enough to be known, but the investigation still required confirmation. Genetic genealogy could provide a potential family lineage, but police emphasized that it was not itself a direct DNA match. Investigators had to build the case from the genealogical lead. They followed the evidence. They reviewed the investigative history. They examined Hoover's connection to the Jessup family. And eventually, investigators obtained a DNA sample from Hoover's autopsy material. The comparison provided the confirmation they needed. On October 9, 2020, Toronto police positively confirmed the identity of the person responsible for the DNA sample found on Christine's underwear, Calvin Hoover. The announcement came more than 36 years after Christine disappeared. But there was another devastating detail. Hoover had died in 2015. He would never stand trial. He would never answer questions from detectives. He would never face Christine's family in court. Police Chief James Raymer stated that if Hoover were alive, Toronto police would arrest him for Christine's murder. The cold case had finally been solved, but the person investigators identified was beyond the reach of the justice system. For Christine's family, the announcement brought relief, anger, sadness, and shock. They finally had an answer, but the answer was painfully complicated. The man identified as responsible had been someone known to the family, someone who had existed around them, someone who had reportedly even participated in the search for Christine after she disappeared. The case had come full circle in the most disturbing way imaginable. The child who disappeared in 1984 had finally been given an answer in 2020. The innocent man who had once been convicted had been exonerated decades earlier. The biological evidence that had survived for more than 30 years had finally pointed investigators toward the person responsible. But one question remained suspended in the air. How had a man known to the family managed to remain unidentified for so long? And what happened during those final moments before Christine vanished? Those questions would become the final shadows hanging over a case that had already endured one of the most painful journeys in Canadian criminal history. On the afternoon of October 3rd, 1984, the world of Christine Jessup's family changed in a matter of hours. She was 9 years old. She had come home from school in Queensville, Ontario, and there was nothing about the beginning of that afternoon that suggested the terrible chain of events about to unfold. Christine was supposed to meet a friend at a nearby park. It was an ordinary plan for a child, but she never arrived. At first, the disappearance was treated as a search for a missing girl. That meant urgency. It meant questions. It meant knocking on doors, checking familiar places, looking along roads, and searching the surrounding area. Where had Christine gone? Had she left voluntarily? Had someone approached her? Had she encountered an accident? Every possibility had to be considered. But as the hours passed, hope began to collide with fear. Christine had vanished after returning home from school. Her absence was not easily explained. The people who knew her were suddenly forced into a nightmare no family expects to experience. The search expanded. Investigators tried to reconstruct her movements. They needed to know exactly when she had been seen and by whom. They needed to determine whether anyone unusual had been near the area. They needed to understand the places Christine might have visited after leaving home. Every detail mattered because a missing child leaves behind a rapidly shrinking window of possibility. In those first hours, however, nobody knew that the case would become one of Canada's most notorious criminal investigations. Nobody knew that the search would eventually lead to a homicide investigation. Nobody knew that an innocent man would be convicted. And nobody knew that the real killer would remain unidentified for more than 3 decades. Christine's disappearance became increasingly frightening as the search continued without an answer. Her family could not simply assume she would return. The police could not simply wait. The community became involved. People searched. Questions spread. The face of a missing 9-year-old became associated with an investigation that would eventually receive national attention. Then came December 31st, nearly 3 months after Christine vanished. Her body was discovered in a farmer's field near Sunderland, Ontario. The location was far from the ordinary environment where Christine had last been seen. The discovery transformed everything. The missing child had become a murder victim. Investigators now faced a crime scene, physical evidence, and a devastating responsibility: determine who had killed her. The forensic examination revealed that Christine had been sexually assaulted and stabbed. The case immediately became a homicide investigation. The discovery also meant that investigators now had to reconstruct not only where Christine had gone, but what had happened to her after she disappeared. The investigation became intensely focused on physical evidence. Detectives searched for fingerprints, trace evidence, and biological material. They needed something that could identify the person responsible, but this was 1984. DNA profiling was not yet the routine forensic tool it would later become. Investigators were working in a period when biological evidence could be collected and preserved, but the technology to transform that evidence into a definitive genetic identity was still developing. As the investigation continued, suspicion eventually focused on Christine's neighbor, Guy Paul Moran. Moran was a local man. His connection to the family and his proximity to the Jessup home made him an obvious investigative focus. But being suspicious of someone is not the same as proving that person committed a murder. The investigation against Moran would eventually become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. He was arrested and charged. The prosecution proceeded. The community watched as a suspect was transformed into an accused killer. But the evidence was not as strong as investigators initially believed. Moran maintained his innocence. The case against him nevertheless moved forward, and he was eventually convicted. The conviction brought what appeared to be an end, but it was the wrong ending. The real killer remained free. Christine's family had lost their daughter. Now an innocent man was imprisoned, and the evidence that would eventually expose the truth had not yet reached its full potential. Years later, DNA testing became more advanced. Biological evidence associated with Christine's murder could be tested with far greater precision. The testing ultimately excluded Moran. The man who had been convicted was not the source of the biological evidence. In 1995, Moran's conviction was overturned. His exoneration became a landmark moment in Canadian legal history, but it also reopened the most painful question of all. If Moran did not kill Christine, who did? The investigation had to begin again from a completely different position. There was no longer a convicted killer to focus on. There was an unidentified killer. The DNA evidence became central. Investigators now possessed a biological profile from evidence associated with the crime, but there was no direct identification. The profile was effectively a fingerprint without a name. It could distinguish the killer from everyone else, but it could not tell detectives who he was unless they could find a matching reference sample. Traditional DNA databases were searched. No answer emerged. The case remained cold. Christine's name continued to represent a tragedy that had never received a complete explanation. Her family continued living with questions. Moran had to rebuild a life after wrongful imprisonment. Investigators continued carrying the weight of a murder that had never truly been solved. Then, decades later, genetic genealogy began changing what was possible. The same biological evidence that had once only excluded an innocent man could potentially identify the real killer. Investigators could now search genetic genealogy databases for relatives of the unknown DNA contributor. That meant the search no longer had to begin with the killer himself. It could begin with his family. A distant relative could become the first thread. A family tree could become the map. A name could emerge from generations of records, and eventually, that method would lead investigators to Calvin Hoover. The revelation was disturbing precisely because Hoover was not an unknown outsider. He had been connected to the Jessup family. He had been part of their wider social circle. He had lived in the same community. He had been 28 years old when Christine was murdered, and according to police, he had even participated in the search for the missing child. That detail cast the earlier investigation in a chilling new light. The man investigators eventually identified as responsible had been close enough to know the family and close enough to become part of the community response. Yet his identity remained hidden for decades. The case had gone from a missing child investigation to a homicide, from a homicide to a wrongful conviction, from a wrongful conviction to an exoneration, and finally to a genetic investigation that reached backward through time. But the most important piece of evidence had been waiting throughout all of it. The DNA had never changed, only the technology had. And once investigators learned how to follow that DNA through a family tree, the identity that had escaped them since 1984 began moving into focus. The question was no longer simply where Christine had gone. The question was, who had left the biological evidence behind? And after more than 30 years of silence, investigators were finally close to an answer. The first great shock in the Christine Jessup investigation was not the discovery of her killer. It was the discovery that the man convicted of killing her had not done it. For years, Guy Paul Moran carried the weight of a murder that the evidence would eventually prove he did not commit. His name became inseparable from Christine Jessup's death. His face became associated with the investigation, and his conviction appeared to give authorities an answer. But it was an answer built on evidence that could not survive the scrutiny of modern forensic science. Behind that wrongful conviction, the real killer remained free. The story began with the disappearance of 9-year-old Christine on October 3rd, SIL 1984, in Queensville, Ontario. She had returned home from school, but she never reached the park where she was expected to meet a friend. The search that followed quickly became a nightmare. Family members, neighbors, and police tried to reconstruct her movements, searching for anything that might explain where she had gone. Then, on December 31st, Christine's body was discovered in a farmer's field near Sunderland. The investigation changed instantly. Detectives were no longer searching for a missing child. They were investigating a murder. The forensic examination revealed that Christine had been sexually assaulted and stabbed. Investigators searched for evidence capable of identifying whoever had taken her life. But in 1984, forensic DNA profiling was still in its infancy. Biological evidence could be collected, but the ability to turn a tiny biological trace into an extraordinarily precise genetic identification was not yet available in the way it would become decades later. Investigators therefore relied heavily on conventional police work, interviews, witness statements, circumstantial evidence, connections between people. The search for a suspect gradually narrowed toward Guy Paul Moran, Christine's neighbor. Moran became the focus of the investigation, and suspicion intensified. Eventually, he was arrested and charged with Christine's murder. To the public, the case appeared to be moving toward an ending, but an arrest is not proof. A prosecution is not proof. Even a conviction is not necessarily the truth. The truth must survive evidence. In Moran's case, it eventually did not. He maintained that he was innocent. The investigation and prosecution continued. He was eventually convicted, creating what appeared to be a resolution to a case that had devastated the community. But Christine's family had not received the truth. They had received a conviction. Those are not always the same thing. As the years passed, forensic science changed dramatically. DNA profiling became more sophisticated, more reliable, and increasingly central to criminal investigation. Biological evidence connected to Christine's murder could now be tested in ways investigators in 1984 could never have imagined. The testing produced a devastating result for the original prosecution. The DNA did not belong to Guy Paul Moran. The man who had spent years under suspicion was not the source of the biological evidence associated with the crime. His conviction was overturned in 1995. Suddenly, the case was back where it had begun, but with an even more disturbing reality. Christine was still dead. The real killer was still free, and an innocent man had lost years of his life because investigators had pursued the wrong person. Moran's exoneration became a landmark in Canadian criminal justice, but for the Jessup family, it also meant the nightmare had reopened. There was no longer a convenient suspect. There was no longer a conviction that could be treated as the conclusion. There was an unidentified person whose DNA had survived inside the evidence. The biological material became one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Investigators had a genetic profile. What they did not have was a name. That distinction would define the case for decades. The profile could tell them that the person who left the biological material was not Moran. It could potentially exclude other suspects, but unless the profile matched someone already in a law enforcement database, it could not immediately reveal the identity of the killer. Searches were conducted. No definitive match appeared. The case entered the world of cold cases, where evidence remains but answers disappear. Years passed. Christine's childhood friends grew older. Her family aged. Investigators retired. The original investigation became part of Canadian criminal history. But the biological evidence remained. Then the science changed again. Genetic genealogy introduced an entirely different strategy. Instead of searching only for the unknown killer, investigators could search for relatives of the unknown killer. The concept was revolutionary. A person might never have been arrested. Their DNA might never have entered a police database, but a relative might have voluntarily submitted genetic information to a genealogy service. That relative could become the beginning of a family tree. The family tree could lead investigators toward the unknown contributor, and eventually, the unknown contributor could become a named suspect. This was the method that would eventually transform Christine Jessup's cold case. Investigators began working with genetic genealogy specialists. The DNA profile from the crime evidence was examined against genealogical databases. The search did not immediately produce a simple answer. Instead, it produced relationships, distant connections, potential family branches, names that had to be investigated carefully. Every branch represented a possibility, but every possibility had to be tested against the facts. The process required patience. Genealogical research could identify relatives, but it could not by itself establish that a particular person committed a murder. Investigators had to combine genetics with traditional police work. They needed to determine whether a potential suspect was alive in 1984, whether he was in the relevant area, whether his age was consistent with the evidence, and whether there were other circumstances connecting him to Christine. Eventually, one name emerged from that process: Calvin Hoover. Hoover had been 28 years old at the time of Christine's murder. He was not simply a distant stranger whose name appeared on a database. He had a connection to the Jessup family. His wife had a relationship with Christine's mother. The families knew one another. The children were familiar with one another. That connection made the identification especially disturbing. The investigation was no longer pointing toward an anonymous figure hidden somewhere in the country. It was pointing toward a man who had existed within the wider social world surrounding Christine's family. But investigators still needed confirmation. Genetic genealogy could generate a lead, but police needed stronger evidence before publicly identifying someone as responsible for a homicide. They therefore continued investigating. The genealogical connection was only one part of the puzzle. Investigators examined Hoover's background and circumstances. They examined his relationship to the Jessup family. They examined the possibility that he had been in the area when Christine disappeared. And then came the crucial forensic step. Investigators obtained a DNA sample associated with Hoover after his death. Hoover had died in 2015, years before investigators identified him. That meant the case could never result in a traditional arrest. But the DNA could still answer the question. The comparison was decisive. The biological evidence associated with Christine's murder matched Hoover. Decades after the crime, the unidentified DNA profile finally had a name: Calvin Hoover. The discovery transformed the case. It also transformed the meaning of everything that had happened before. Guy Paul Morin had been innocent. Christine's killer had never disappeared completely. He had left something behind, and that something had survived long enough for modern science to find him. But there was one chilling detail that made the breakthrough even more difficult to absorb. Hoover had reportedly participated in the search for Christine after she disappeared. The man investigators eventually identified as responsible had been close enough to the family to become part of the community's response to the tragedy. For decades, nobody knew. The killer had remained hidden in plain sight, while an innocent man paid the price for a crime he did not commit. Now, after more than 36 years, the truth was finally emerging, but the investigation still had to confront the most painful question of all. Why had it taken so long? The answer lay partly in the limitations of the original investigation, partly in the wrongful focus on Morin, and partly in the fact that forensic science had not yet developed the tools needed to turn the biological evidence into an identity. The evidence had existed. The answer had existed inside it. What was missing was the technology capable of unlocking it, and when that technology finally arrived, it did not simply identify a killer. It rewrote the history of the entire case. For more than 3 decades, the most important witness in the Christine Jessup case could not speak. It had no memory. It could not describe a face, repeat a conversation, or point a finger. It was a biological trace recovered during the investigation, preserved through years of uncertainty and technological change. But eventually, that silent evidence would become the key to identifying the person investigators believed was responsible for Christine's murder. The story of that DNA begins with the terrible discovery that transformed the case from a missing child investigation into a homicide investigation. On December 31st, still 1984, Christine's body was found in a farmer's field near Sunderland, Ontario. She had disappeared almost 3 months earlier. Her family had spent those weeks living through uncertainty, hoping that the little girl who had vanished might somehow be found alive. Instead, the discovery delivered the answer no parent ever wants to hear. Christine was dead. The forensic investigation began immediately. Every detail mattered. Investigators needed to understand how Christine had died, where she had been before her death, and whether the person responsible had left anything behind. The examination established that she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed. Biological evidence was recovered. At the time, however, investigators did not have the forensic technology that would eventually make that evidence decisive. The concept of DNA profiling existed, but it was still developing. The extraordinary power that modern investigators now associate with DNA had not yet become an everyday reality in homicide investigations. That technological gap would have enormous consequences. Investigators had evidence, but evidence without the right analytical method can remain frustratingly silent. The investigation instead focused on people around Christine. One of those people was her neighbor, Guy Paul Moran. Moran became the principal suspect. The case against him developed through investigative decisions that would later be heavily criticized. He was arrested. He was charged. Eventually, he was convicted. To the outside world, the mystery seemed to have an answer. But beneath that apparent resolution was a fatal problem. The wrong man had been identified. Moran maintained his innocence, and years later, advances in DNA testing finally gave investigators a way to examine the biological evidence more precisely. The results were devastating. The DNA associated with the crime did not match Moran. The man convicted of Christine's murder was not the source of the biological evidence. In 1995, Moran's conviction was overturned. His exoneration exposed a deeper failure in the investigation. The case had not merely failed to identify the real killer. It had sent an innocent man to prison. The true killer remained outside the reach of the justice system. But the DNA profile now had a new significance. It could exclude Moran. More importantly, it represented the genetic signature of the unknown person who had left biological material connected to the crime. Investigators now had a much stronger tool than they had possessed in 1984. They had a profile. They needed a person. Traditional forensic databases seemed like the obvious next step. The profile could be compared with DNA belonging to known offenders. If the killer had ever been arrested and his DNA collected, there was a possibility of a direct match. But the search produced no identification. The unknown man remained unknown. This was the frustrating paradox of forensic DNA. A profile can be extraordinarily specific and still tell investigators nothing about a person's name if there is no reference sample against which to compare it. The evidence could say, in effect, this is the same person. It could not say, this is who that person is. And so the Christine Jessup investigation remained cold. Years passed. The evidence was preserved. The file remained part of the history of a case that had already become infamous for its wrongful conviction. Then a new forensic revolution began. Investigative genetic genealogy changed the question. Instead of searching only for a direct match, investigators could search for biological relatives. The unknown person's DNA might not exist in a criminal database, but perhaps one of his relatives had voluntarily submitted genetic information to a genealogy service. That possibility transformed cold case investigations across North America. The basic principle was simple but powerful. DNA is inherited. A person leaves genetic connections behind through parents, siblings, children, cousins, and more distant relatives. If investigators could identify those relationships, they could potentially construct a family tree leading toward the unknown contributor. The process was far more complicated than simply entering a name into a computer. investigators and genealogists had to examine potential genetic relationships, compare them with historical records, and build possible family lines. They had to eliminate branches that did not fit. They had to verify dates, locations, and identities, and they had to remember that a genealogical lead was not the same as proof of guilt. The science could point investigators toward a person. Traditional police work still had to determine what that connection meant. In the Christine Jessup investigation, the genetic genealogy process eventually produced a crucial lead. Investigators began looking at family relationships connected to the unknown DNA profile. As the family tree developed, one individual emerged as a potential match: Calvin Hoover. Hoover's name immediately raised another layer of significance. He had not been a random person discovered somewhere far from the investigation. He had a connection to Christine's family. His wife had a relationship with Christine's mother. The families had known each other. This meant that the genealogical lead was not simply a genetic possibility. It had a geographical and social context. Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984. He had lived in the region. The circumstances placed him within the world surrounding Christine's disappearance. Investigators now had a person who potentially fit both the genetic and historical picture. But they could not stop there. A cold case cannot be solved responsibly by intuition. Investigators needed confirmation. They needed a direct comparison between the DNA associated with Christine's murder and DNA belonging to Hoover. The challenge was that Hoover was no longer alive. He had died in 2015, but modern forensic investigation does not necessarily stop when a suspect dies. Biological material can survive after death. Investigators were able to obtain a sample associated with Hoover and conduct the comparison. The result was the moment the case had been waiting for. The DNA profile connected to Christine's murder matched Hoover. After decades of uncertainty, the silent biological evidence finally pointed to a name: Calvin Hoover. But the discovery came with an extraordinary sense of irony. The killer investigators had been searching for since 1984 had died 5 years before his identity was established. The case had been waiting for science to catch up with him, and by the time it did, he was beyond the reach of the court. Toronto police announced in October 2020 that Hoover was the person responsible for the DNA sample recovered from Christine's clothing. The announcement closed the central investigative question, but it did not create the traditional ending that homicide cases usually produce. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, no trial, no verdict. There could only be an official conclusion based on the evidence. For Christine's family, the revelation was both an answer and another wound. For Guy Paul Moran, it was confirmation of what he had spent years insisting: he had not killed Christine. For investigators, it was the final transformation of a case that had once seemed trapped in the past. The DNA that could not speak in 1984 had finally spoken in 2020, and its message was devastating. The biological evidence had never forgotten. It had simply been waiting for investigators to learn how to read it. But the identification of Hoover raised another question that could not be answered by genetics alone. If he was responsible, how had he remained outside suspicion for so long? How close had he been to the investigation? And what did the people around Christine know about him before anyone knew what he had done? Those questions would push the case beyond forensic science and into the most unsettling territory of all: the possibility that the person responsible had been close to the family while the entire community searched desperately for a missing child. The most chilling discoveries in a cold case are not always hidden fingerprints or forgotten documents. Sometimes the most disturbing clue is a relationship that was there from the beginning, visible to everyone but understood by no one. In the Christine Jessup investigation, that realization came decades after the murder, when genetic genealogy led investigators toward Calvin Hoover. The man whose DNA was ultimately connected to the biological evidence had not been a complete stranger to Christine's family. He was part of the wider social circle surrounding them. His wife had a relationship with Christine's mother. The families knew one another. The children were familiar with each other. And according to investigators, Hoover had participated in the search after Christine disappeared. That detail cast the entire tragedy in a different light. Imagine a community searching for a missing 9-year-old. Imagine neighbors walking roads, checking fields, asking questions, hoping against hope that the child might still be alive. Imagine people coming together because one of their own children has vanished, and somewhere within that circle, according to the later investigation, was the man investigators would eventually identify as responsible. In 1984, nobody knew the search proceeded without the knowledge that the person who had left the biological evidence behind was not necessarily hiding somewhere beyond the community. He could be standing inside it. The investigation began under enormous pressure. Christine was only 9. Her disappearance had already created fear, and the discovery of her body transformed that fear into horror. Investigators had to work quickly while facing an enormous amount of uncertainty. Who had last seen Christine? What had happened after she returned home? How had she been taken away? Where had she been during the weeks before her body was discovered? And who had access to her? The answers were not obvious. The community wanted a suspect. The police needed evidence. The family needed the truth. Those demands collided as the investigation developed. Eventually, Guy Paul Moran became the central suspect. His proximity to Christine's home made him a logical person for investigators to examine, but the case against him would eventually collapse under DNA evidence. That failure was not a minor technical error. It became one of Canada's most notorious examples of wrongful conviction. Morin was convicted of Christine's murder and spent years in prison before DNA testing demonstrated that he was not the source of the biological evidence. His conviction was overturned in 1995. The exoneration forced investigators and the public to confront a devastating reality. While an innocent man had been convicted, the person who actually killed Christine had remained free. The real killer had left DNA behind, but that DNA had no name. The evidence was powerful enough to exclude Morin, but not powerful enough at that time to identify the person responsible. The case entered another long period of uncertainty. For the Jessup family, there was no resolution. For Morin, there was the enormous task of rebuilding a life after wrongful imprisonment. For investigators, there was an unidentified genetic profile connected to the murder of a child. The case could have remained frozen indefinitely. Then, genetic genealogy changed the possibilities. The unknown DNA contributor did not need to appear in a criminal database for investigators to begin searching. A relative could be enough. The genetic connections could provide a route toward the killer, even if the killer himself had never been arrested. Investigators and genealogists began reconstructing family relationships. The process was slow and methodical. Every genetic connection had to be evaluated. Every family branch had to be examined. Historical records had to be compared against the genetic information. Potential candidates had to fit the timeline. Eventually, Calvin Hoover emerged. His connection to Christine's family made the lead particularly significant. This was not simply a name produced by a distant genetic relationship. There was a human connection. Hoover had been part of the same broader community. He had known people connected to Christine. He had been 28 years old at the time of the murder. The pieces began to align, but investigators still needed direct forensic confirmation. Genetic genealogy can generate a lead, but a lead must be tested. Investigators obtained DNA from Hoover's autopsy material after his death in 2015. The comparison provided the critical confirmation. The DNA associated with the crime was connected to Hoover. The man who had remained unidentified since 1984 finally had a name. The case that had once seemed to have been solved by the conviction of Guy Paul Morin had actually been pointing in the wrong direction for years. The real killer had been outside the courtroom, outside the prison, and outside the criminal database, but he had not been outside the evidence. That distinction is crucial. Hoover may have escaped identification for decades, but he had left behind a biological trace that could eventually be connected to him. Time did not erase it. The development of genetic genealogy did not create the evidence. It created a way to interpret it. The discovery also revealed the extraordinary limitations of the original investigation. In 1984, investigators were working without the modern tools that could have rapidly identified an unknown DNA contributor. The wrongful conviction of Morin further diverted the investigation. Once authorities believed they had the person responsible, the case naturally moved toward prosecution rather than continued exploration of alternative suspects. The conviction created an apparent ending, but the DNA evidence never supported that ending. It remained inconsistent with Moran. When modern testing finally exposed the error, investigators were forced to reopen the search for the person whose DNA actually belonged to the crime scene. That search would eventually lead to Hoover, yet the emotional impact of his connection to the family is difficult to ignore. The man investigators identified as responsible had not been a mysterious criminal figure who appeared from nowhere. He had been connected to people Christine knew. He lived within the same broader social environment, and he was reportedly involved in the search after she disappeared. The image is disturbing because it illustrates how little investigators and the community understood at the time. People were looking outward for the person responsible while the answer was already within the surrounding network. But investigators could not know what they did not know. Without the DNA connection, Hoover was simply another person within a community shattered by the disappearance of a child. The evidence changed his status decades later. The genetic profile created a connection that ordinary investigation had failed to establish. And once the connection was confirmed, the past was suddenly seen through a completely different lens. The search for Christine had been an enormous community effort. People wanted her found. They wanted her brought home. They wanted whoever had taken her to be caught. Yet the man investigators ultimately identified was already dead by the time the scientific breakthrough arrived. He could not be arrested. He could not be questioned. He could not explain why he had done it. He could not answer what happened during the missing hours between Christine leaving home and the events that ended her life. Those questions would remain permanently beyond the reach of investigators. Toronto police announced the identification in 2020, describing the case as solved and stating that Hoover would have been arrested and charged had he still been alive. The announcement brought the investigation to a remarkable conclusion, but it also highlighted the limits of solving a crime decades later. The truth can arrive after justice is no longer possible in the conventional sense. A name can be discovered after the person carrying it is gone. Evidence can survive longer than the suspect, but for Christine's family, there was still something profoundly important in knowing. The unknown person responsible had finally been identified. The innocent man once convicted had been cleared, and the DNA that had remained silent for more than 3 decades had finally provided the answer. Still, one question remained more disturbing than any other. How could the real killer have lived for so many years without being exposed? The answer was hidden in the limitations of the time, the absence of a database match, the wrongful focus on Moran, and the simple fact that forensic science had not yet learned how to follow DNA through a family tree. But the case was about to reveal something even more powerful. The technology that finally exposed Hoover did not merely solve a murder. It demonstrated how an old investigation could be reconstructed from the biological evidence that had survived it. And for Christine Jessup, that evidence would become the closest thing to a witness she had ever had. For 36 years, Christine Jessup's killer existed without a name in the official story. Police had evidence, they had a DNA profile. They had a history of investigation, mistakes, arrests, courtroom battles, and an eventual exoneration. But they did not have the one thing a homicide investigation ultimately needs: a person who could be identified as responsible. The breakthrough came when investigators stopped asking the DNA to produce a direct match and began asking it a different question. Who are this person's relatives? It was a radical change in direction. Instead of searching for the killer inside the traditional criminal justice system, investigators searched for his genetic family. The distinction would ultimately transform the Christine Jessup case. The biological evidence associated with the murder had survived for decades. It contained a genetic signature that was capable of distinguishing one person from another. But a profile without a reference sample is like a locked door without a key. Investigators knew they had the genetic signature of the person responsible, but they did not know whose signature it was. Traditional DNA databases could help when a suspect had already been arrested or when his genetic information had entered the system for another reason. But what if the killer had never been arrested? What if his DNA had never been collected? What if he had lived an ordinary life while the investigation remained frozen? That was precisely the problem. The person investigators were looking for was not necessarily in the database. Genetic genealogy offered another route. Instead of requiring the killer's DNA to be present, investigators could potentially identify relatives who had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to genealogy databases. Those relatives might be distant. They might never have heard of Christine. They might never have imagined that their DNA could one day become part of a homicide investigation. But shared genetics can create connections that reach across generations. One person becomes a branch. Another becomes a second branch. Historical records fill in the gap. Birth records, marriages, census information, obituaries, and family histories can transform a genetic relationship into a family tree. And somewhere inside that tree, investigators hoped, was the man whose DNA had been left behind. The process required caution. A genetic genealogy lead is not automatically proof of guilt. It is a direction for investigators to explore. Every possible suspect must be evaluated independently. The person must fit the circumstances. The timeline must make sense. Geography matters. Age matters. Relationships matter. Investigators must distinguish between someone who is genetically connected and someone who could actually have been present when the crime occurred. The Christine Jessup investigation eventually produced a name that demanded further scrutiny: Calvin Hoover. Hoover was not an obvious suspect from the original investigation. He was not the man who had been convicted. He was not a notorious criminal whose name had appeared repeatedly in police files. He emerged through a completely different investigative pathway, and once investigators examined his background, the connection became deeply significant. Hoover had been 28 years old when Christine was murdered. He had connections to the Jessup family through his wife. The families knew each other. He was part of the broader social environment surrounding Christine. The genetic genealogy lead was therefore not pointing toward an impossible candidate. It was pointing toward someone who fit the historical circumstances. But investigators still had to prove the connection. The question was no longer whether Hoover could theoretically be related to the unknown DNA contributor. The question was whether his DNA actually matched the biological evidence from Christine's murder. That required a direct comparison. Hoover had died in 2015, so investigators could not simply approach him and request a sample. But his death did not necessarily mean his DNA was inaccessible. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from his autopsy material. That sample could be compared with the genetic profile developed from the evidence connected to Christine's murder. The result was decisive. The DNA matched. The unknown contributor had a name: Calvin Hoover. The discovery represented one of the most remarkable turns in the history of the case. The DNA that had once only excluded Guy Paul Moran now identified the man investigators believed was responsible. The biological evidence had survived the original investigation, survived the wrongful conviction, survived Moran's exoneration, and survived decades of technological change. Then, through genetic genealogy, it finally pointed toward the truth. The announcement in 2020 was not simply a routine cold case update. It represented the conclusion of a story that had exposed the strengths and weaknesses of criminal investigation over an entire generation. A child had disappeared. A body had been found. An innocent man had been convicted. DNA had cleared him. The real killer had remained unidentified. Then a new forensic technique had connected the old evidence to a deceased man. The case had finally come full circle. But there was something else that made the discovery especially disturbing. Hoover was not alive to hear his name announced. He had died 5 years before investigators identified him. The man who might have provided the answers was permanently beyond interrogation. He could not explain how he became involved in Christine's death. He could not tell investigators what happened after Christine disappeared. He could not confirm or deny the circumstances surrounding the crime. He could not explain why biological evidence connected him to the murder. The forensic evidence could establish a connection, but it could not reconstruct every missing moment. That meant some questions would remain forever unanswered. The investigation could determine who the DNA belonged to. It could not force the dead man to tell the complete story. And that is one of the cruelest realities of cold case investigations. Sometimes the truth arrives after the opportunity to question the person responsible has disappeared. The investigation becomes a conversation with evidence rather than a conversation with a suspect. In Christine's case, that evidence had a long history. It had been collected in the aftermath of a child's murder. It had been preserved while investigators pursued Morin. It had eventually been used to demonstrate that Morin was innocent. It then remained available while investigators searched for the real contributor. Finally, decades later, it became the foundation of the genetic genealogy investigation. The evidence never changed. The investigative tools did. This is why the case became so significant in the era of genetic genealogy. It demonstrated that the solution to a cold case does not always require a new witness. Sometimes the witness already exists. Sometimes investigators simply need a new method of listening. For decades, Christine's biological evidence had been silent because nobody could connect it to a person. Genetic genealogy created that connection. It transformed an unidentified DNA profile into a family relationship. The family relationship became a genealogical trail. The trail led to Hoover, and direct DNA comparison confirmed the link. Each step reduced the distance between the crime and the truth. Yet the emotional distance remained enormous. Christine had been 9 years old when she was killed. Her family had lived through decades without knowing who was responsible. Guy Paul Morin had spent years in prison for a crime he did not commit, and the man investigators ultimately identified had died without facing a courtroom. There was no conventional ending. There was only a forensic conclusion. But sometimes a forensic conclusion is the most powerful answer a cold case can provide. It can restore a victim's name to the center of the story. It can correct an injustice. It can identify a person who had escaped detection for decades. And it can prove that evidence preserved in the past still matters in the present. For Christine Jessup, the family tree had finally led investigators back to the crime. The branches of genealogy had stretched across generations until they reached a man who had been 28 years old in 1984. The DNA had provided the final confirmation. The unknown contributor was no longer anonymous. The killer was no longer simply a question. But there was one final complication that made the resolution feel incomplete. The man investigators had identified was dead. The evidence had found him, but the justice system could not. And somewhere between those two realities lay the painful final chapter of Christine Jessup's story. A murder solved without a trial, a killer identified without an arrest, and a family finally given an answer after decades of silence. The name Calvin Hoover did not emerge from a confession. It did not appear because a witness suddenly remembered seeing him near Christine Jessup on the day she disappeared. It emerged from something far more complex. A genetic trail buried inside the family tree of an unknown man. For decades, investigators had possessed biological evidence connected to Christine's murder without knowing whose it was. In 2020, that evidence finally pointed towards someone. But the moment Hoover's name appeared, the investigation entered a new and deeply unsettling stage. A name alone was not enough. Investigators needed to understand who Hoover was, where he had lived, how old he had been in 1984, what connection he had to Christine's family, and whether the genetic evidence could be directly confirmed. Every question mattered because the case had already suffered one catastrophic failure. An innocent man, Guy Paul Morin, had been convicted. Investigators could not afford another mistake. Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984. He lived in the broader area connected to the case. More significantly, his family had connections to Christine's family. His wife had a relationship with Christine's mother, meaning Hoover was not merely someone whose name happened to appear in a distant genealogical branch. He existed within the social environment surrounding the victim. That connection gave investigators a reason to look closer, but it also made the revelation more disturbing. The person investigators were now examining had been close enough to be part of the community response when Christine disappeared. According to Toronto police, Hoover had participated in the search for the missing girl. If the later forensic conclusion was correct, that meant the man investigators eventually identified as responsible had been involved in the desperate effort to find the child he had allegedly killed. The irony was almost unbearable. While Christine's family and neighbors searched for answers, the person responsible was apparently living among them. Yet investigators in 1984 had no genetic genealogy. They did not possess the modern ability to compare an unknown DNA profile against distant relatives. They could not search millions of family connections. They could only investigate the people and evidence available to them at the time. The focus fell on Moran. He became the suspect. The investigation moved toward him. Eventually, he was convicted. The conviction created the appearance of closure, but the biological evidence remained inconsistent with him. Years later, DNA testing exposed the error. Moran was exonerated. The case was suddenly forced back into uncertainty. The real killer was still somewhere in the evidence, but his identity remained hidden. That was the situation until genetic genealogy opened the door. The process was painstaking. Investigators started with the unknown DNA profile and searched for genetic relatives. The objective was not simply to find a person with a similar genetic pattern. It was to construct relationships that could lead toward the source of the DNA. Genealogists worked backward and sideways through family structures, combining genetic information with historical records. A distant relative could reveal a family branch. A family branch could reveal another branch. Eventually, the investigation could narrow the possibilities to a small number of individuals. The name Calvin Hoover became significant because the genealogical evidence and the historical circumstances appeared to converge, but police still needed confirmation. A cold case that had already produced a wrongful conviction required an exceptionally careful approach. The investigators needed a direct genetic comparison. Hoover was no longer alive. He had died in 2015, 5 years before police publicly identified him. But biological material from his autopsy provided investigators with the opportunity to test the genealogical lead. The comparison was decisive. The DNA from the crime evidence was consistent with Hoover's DNA. The unknown contributor had finally been identified. In October 2020, Toronto police announced that Calvin Hoover was responsible for the DNA sample found on Christine's underwear and that he was considered responsible for Christine's murder. The announcement ended one of the longest and most complicated searches in Canadian criminal history. But it had also exposed a painful truth. The man investigators identified could never be brought to court. He was already dead. If Hoover had been alive, police said he would have been arrested and charged. Instead, investigators could only close the case through forensic identification. There would be no dramatic arrest, no interrogation, no courtroom confession, no jury verdict. The case ended with evidence rather than punishment. For Christine's family, the identification brought an answer that had been missing since 1984, but the answer itself was devastating. The man investigators identified had been part of their wider social world. He was not an unknown figure who had vanished into another province or disappeared under a false identity. He had been someone whose life had intersected with theirs. And that realization forced a disturbing question. Had Christine's family unknowingly crossed paths with the person responsible after her death? Had they spoken to him? Had they seen him during the search? Had he listened as people discussed Christine's disappearance? The evidence cannot answer those questions. Investigators can establish a genetic connection, but they cannot reconstruct every interaction that took place during the years before the killer was identified. That uncertainty is part of what makes the case so haunting. The identity was finally known, but the human story remained fragmented. The DNA could tell investigators who had contributed the biological material. It could not explain the person's thoughts. It could not provide a motive. It could not describe the events that led to Christine's death, and it could not tell her family why. Those answers may have disappeared forever. The case also revealed how profoundly the passage of time can change an investigation. In 1984, DNA evidence did not have the power it would eventually possess. In the 1990s, DNA helped clear Moran. In the 2010 S and 2020 S, genetic genealogy created a new pathway to identification. The investigation evolved because science evolved. The same evidence could produce different answers at different points in history. First, it demonstrated that Moran was not the killer. Later, it helped investigators identify Hoover. That progression is one of the most important lessons in the case. Evidence does not always reveal everything at once. Sometimes an investigation must wait for the right technology, and sometimes the right technology appears decades after the crime. Christine's case became a powerful demonstration of that reality. The DNA had survived. The investigators had preserved it. The profile had remained available even when traditional searches produced nothing. Genetic genealogy provided the missing bridge. It was not magic. It was not a single database search that instantly produced a killer's name. It was a process of genetic analysis, genealogical research, and traditional police investigation. Every piece had to fit. The final confirmation came through direct DNA comparison, and when that confirmation arrived, the case changed forever. But one fact remained impossible to escape. Christine was still only 9 years old when she died. She never grew into the teenager she should have become. She never reached adulthood. She never had the chance to build the life that had been waiting for her. Her family lived through decades of uncertainty while an innocent man endured the consequences of a wrongful conviction. Meanwhile, the man eventually identified through genetic evidence had died without ever being publicly exposed as Christine's killer. The case had finally found its answer, but the answer came too late for a traditional form of justice, and that left investigators facing the final question that genetic genealogy could not solve. What could be done with the truth once the person responsible was already gone? The answer would come not through another laboratory test, but through the simple act of acknowledging what the evidence had finally established. Christine Jessup's killer had a name. After more than 36 years, the unknown man was no longer unknown. But the story of how that name had remained hidden for so long was only becoming more disturbing. By the time investigators finally knew the name Calvin Hoover, the man himself had already been dead for 5 years. That single fact transformed what should have been the most dramatic moment of the investigation into something strangely quiet. There would be no police cars surrounding his home, no handcuffs, no interrogation room, no courtroom, no judge announcing a sentence. The breakthrough arrived in 2020, but Hoover had died in 2015. The evidence had caught up with him only after he was beyond the reach of the criminal justice system. For Christine Jessup's family, that reality carried a complicated mixture of emotions. After more than 3 decades of uncertainty, they finally knew who investigators believed was responsible. But they would never hear the explanation that only the man himself could have provided. They would never know exactly what he had been thinking. They would never hear him describe what happened. They would never see him face a courtroom. The truth had arrived, but it had arrived late. The investigation had begun on October 3rd, Sill 1984, when Christine disappeared after returning home from school. She was 9 years old. Her disappearance triggered a search that would become one of the most haunting investigations in Canadian history. The community searched. Police searched. Her family waited. Every passing hour increased the fear that something terrible had happened. Then, on December 31st, Christine's body was found in a farmer's field near Sunderland. The search for a missing child became a murder investigation. The forensic examination revealed that Christine had been sexually assaulted and investigators collected evidence, but the technology required to identify the killer through DNA did not yet exist in the form it would later take. The investigation turned toward conventional methods. Eventually, suspicion fell on Guy Paul Morin. Morin was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. But the conviction was wrong. Modern DNA testing eventually established that Morin was not the source of the biological evidence connected to the crime. His conviction was overturned in 1995. The consequences were enormous. An innocent man had been imprisoned. Christine's real killer remained free, and the evidence that could ultimately identify him was still sitting inside the case file, waiting for technology to catch up. Years passed. The DNA profile remained unidentified through traditional database searches. There was no direct match. The investigation had reached the familiar dead end of a cold case. Powerful evidence without a name. Then genetic genealogy offered a new possibility. Investigators could search for relatives of the unknown DNA contributor. The process opened pathways that did not exist in the original investigation. A distant genetic connection could lead to a family tree. A family tree could lead to a person. That person could then be tested against the original evidence. Eventually, the investigation led to Calvin Hoover. Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984. He had connections to Christine's family through his wife. He was not simply a name produced from an unrelated genetic branch. His presence within the community gave the genealogical lead additional significance. Investigators followed the trail carefully. Then they obtained DNA from Hoover's autopsy material. The comparison connected Hoover to the biological evidence from Christine's murder. The investigation had finally reached its conclusion. Toronto police publicly identified Hoover in October 2020. The department stated that he was responsible for the DNA sample found on Christine's underwear and that investigators considered him responsible for her murder. Police also made clear that if he had been alive, he would have been arrested and charged. But he was not alive. The man investigators had spent decades trying to identify could no longer answer their questions. This is where the case becomes more than a story about forensic science. It becomes a story about the limits of justice when time moves faster than an investigation. The criminal justice system is built around living participants. Suspects can be questioned. Accused people can defend themselves. Prosecutors can present evidence. Judges can make rulings. Juries can reach verdicts. Victims' families can hear the evidence presented publicly. But when the suspect is dead, those mechanisms disappear. Investigators can identify, they can document, they can explain, but they cannot prosecute. Hoover's death therefore created an unusual ending. The case could be described as solved, but there would be no criminal trial. The evidence could establish responsibility in the investigative sense, but there could be no courtroom verdict. The distinction mattered. Police could explain what the forensic evidence showed, but they could not recreate the missing years. And those missing years were enormous. Christine's murder had shaped the lives of everyone connected to it. Her family grew older. Her friends became adults. Morin spent years fighting to clear his name. Investigators changed careers. Technology transformed. The original crime scene became part of history. Hoover continued living until 2015. For most of those years, the identity of the man connected to the DNA remained unknown to police. The contrast is staggering. The investigation existed in one world. Hoover existed in another. The two finally collided only after his death. Yet the identification also provided an important correction to the historical record. For years, the public knew Morin as the man convicted of Christine's murder. His exoneration corrected that narrative. The genetic identification of Hoover went further. It provided investigators with the person whose DNA was associated with the crime. The case could finally be understood through a sequence of evidence rather than assumption. Morin was not the source. The unknown DNA belonged to someone else. Genetic genealogy led investigators toward Hoover. Direct DNA testing confirmed the connection. The evidence formed a chain that could not be explained by the original theory of the case. The wrong man had been convicted. The right man had remained unidentified. Science eventually corrected both. But science could not answer every question. Why Christine? Why that day? What exactly happened between the moment she disappeared and the moment she was killed? What motivated the attack? Did Hoover ever speak about it to anyone? Did he understand that biological evidence had been left behind? Did he believe the investigation would eventually reach him? Did he follow the case after Christine's death? These are the questions that remain outside the reach of DNA. Genetic material can identify a person. It cannot read a mind. It cannot recover a lost confession. It cannot restore a missing conversation. And it cannot reverse time. That limitation is particularly painful in a case involving a child. Christine should have grown up. Instead, her family spent decades living with a question that seemed impossible to answer. When the answer finally arrived, it was attached to a man who was already gone. There is something almost cruel about that timing. If the investigation had identified Hoover while he was alive, investigators might have questioned him. Prosecutors might have built a case. A courtroom might have heard the evidence. Christine's family might have had the opportunity to see him face the consequences. None of that happened. The evidence arrived too late. But perhaps the most important thing about the breakthrough is that the evidence arrived at all. The biological material had survived more than 3 decades. The genetic profile survived the failure of the original investigation. It survived the wrongful conviction. It survived the exoneration. It survived years of unsuccessful database searches, and eventually, it survived long enough for genetic genealogy to transform it into a path toward the truth. That is why the Christine Jessup case became so important. It demonstrated that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Evidence can remain dormant while technology develops. A mystery can remain unsolved while the tools needed to solve it are being invented. The person responsible can die believing the past has disappeared, while the physical evidence remains. In Christine's case, the past had not disappeared. It had been waiting, and when investigators finally opened the right door, the evidence led them to a name: Calvin Hoover. A man who could never be arrested, a man who could never stand trial, a man whose identity was revealed more than 36 years after Christine disappeared. His death did not erase the forensic evidence. It simply changed what investigators could do with the answer. There would be no trial, but there could be a conclusion. There would be no sentence, but there could be an official identification. There would be no confession, but there could be DNA. And for a family that had lived with uncertainty since 1984, that distinction mattered. The mystery was no longer nameless. The silence had finally been broken, yet one haunting reality remained. For more than 30 years, the person responsible had lived beyond the reach of the investigation. And somewhere inside that long silence was the story of how a 9-year-old girl's disappearance became one of Canada's most enduring cold cases. The Christine Jessup investigation had already become a tragedy before investigators learned the name Calvin Hoover. It was a tragedy because a child had been murdered. It was a tragedy because her family waited decades for answers, but it became something larger because an innocent man was convicted of a crime he did not commit. The case exposed how easily an investigation can move toward the wrong conclusion when suspicion becomes stronger than evidence. Guy Paul Morin was arrested and convicted, yet the biological evidence ultimately demonstrated that he was not the person responsible. His exoneration in 1995 did not simply clear his name. It forced Canada to confront the possibility that the criminal justice system could produce a confident answer that was completely wrong. That reality would remain attached to Christine's case even after genetic genealogy finally identified Calvin Hoover. The investigation, therefore, became a story about two separate searches. One was the search for Christine. The other was the search for the truth. The first search ended with the discovery of her body. The second would take more than 36 years. In October 1984, Christine was a 9-year-old girl living with her family in Queensville, Ontario. She had come home from school and was expected to meet a friend at a nearby park. Instead, she disappeared. The details of those final moments became crucial because investigators needed to reconstruct her movements. The community wanted to know where she had gone. Her family wanted her home. Police needed to determine whether she had left voluntarily or whether someone had intervened. Then the worst possibility became reality. On December 31st, Christine's body was discovered in a farmer's field near Sunderland. The case was now unquestionably a homicide. Investigators searched for evidence. They interviewed people. They examined relationships. Eventually, attention focused on Guy Paul Morin. The case against him developed into a prosecution that ended in conviction. But the conviction was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one of the most painful chapters. Morin maintained his innocence. Years later, DNA testing provided a way to examine the biological evidence with greater accuracy. The results did not support the conviction. Morin was excluded. In 1995, his conviction was overturned. He had spent years in prison for a murder he did not commit. The consequences of the error extended far beyond Morin himself. It meant the actual killer had remained free. It meant Christine's family had been given the wrong answer. And it meant the investigation had to return to the beginning. But the new investigation had something investigators in 1984 did not have: a DNA profile associated with the unknown contributor. That profile became the central unresolved clue. The problem was that no direct database match appeared. Investigators knew the genetic signature belonged to someone. They simply did not know who. For years, the profile remained an unidentified genetic fingerprint. The case was cold. but the evidence was not gone. The breakthrough came decades later when investigators began using investigative genetic genealogy. The method changed the search completely. Instead of looking for the killer himself, investigators could look for people related to him. If a relative had submitted DNA to a genealogy database, that information could provide a pathway toward the unknown contributor. The technique required a combination of science and traditional genealogy. Genetic relationships were examined alongside family records. Investigators worked through branches of ancestry. Names were identified and eliminated. The process eventually led toward Calvin Hoover. Hoover had been 28 when Christine was murdered. He had connections to Christine's family through his wife. He was part of the same broader social world. The historical information gave investigators a reason to examine him closely, but genetics had to provide the final confirmation. Hoover had died in 2015. Investigators obtained DNA from his autopsy material and compared it with the biological evidence connected to Christine's murder. The match confirmed what genetic genealogy had suggested. Hoover was the source of the DNA. Toronto police announced the identification in October 2020. The department stated that Hoover was responsible for the DNA sample found on Christine's underwear and considered him responsible for the murder. If he had been alive, police said, he would have been arrested and charged, but he was dead. The case therefore ended without a prosecution, yet the identification still carried enormous importance because it corrected the historical record. The man convicted in the original investigation was innocent. The man whose DNA was associated with the crime had finally been identified. Two conclusions that had taken decades to establish were suddenly connected by one piece of forensic evidence. The DNA did more than identify Hoover. It also helped explain why the earlier conviction had been wrong. The biological evidence had always pointed away from Moran. The technology simply had not yet been able to reveal where it pointed instead. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation. The evidence did not suddenly become accurate in 2020. It had always been what it was. What changed was the ability of investigators to interpret it. In 1984, DNA could not provide the answer. In the 1990s, it could help establish Moran's innocence. In the 2010 genetic genealogy could transform the same unidentified profile into a family tree. In 2020, investigators could finally connect that tree to a specific individual and confirm the connection through direct DNA testing. The timeline shows how quickly forensic science can change the meaning of an old case. A clue that seems limited in one era can become decisive in another. That is why investigators preserve evidence even when a case appears impossible to solve. The future may possess tools that the present cannot imagine. Christine's case became a powerful example of that principle, but it also carried another lesson. A wrongful conviction does not simply create a legal problem. It creates another human tragedy. Moran's life was profoundly affected by the accusation and conviction. His exoneration could not restore the years he lost. At the same time, Christine's family had to continue living with the knowledge that the person responsible remained unidentified. Their suffering existed alongside Moran's suffering, creating two separate consequences from the same investigative failure. The eventual identification of Hoover could not undo either. It could only establish the truth more accurately than before, and even that truth came with limitations. Because Hoover was dead, investigators could not question him. There would be no complete narrative from the person responsible. No motive could be definitively established through interrogation. No courtroom would test the evidence. The case therefore remained partially mysterious even after it was officially solved. The identity question had been answered. Other questions remained forever suspended. What exactly happened during the final hours of Christine's life? Why was she targeted? What was the killer thinking? What did he do after leaving the scene? How did he lie with the secret? Those questions may never have answers, but the absence of those answers does not diminish the importance of the identification. It demonstrates the limits of what any investigation can recover after so much time has passed. The case had already crossed generations. Christine's friends had grown up. Investigators who worked the original case had retired. Moran had lived through the consequences of a wrongful conviction. Hoover had died. and still the evidence remained. The investigation eventually reached him not through a confession, not through a witness, but through the genetic connections hidden inside his family tree. That development helped establish genetic genealogy as one of the most powerful tools available for investigating certain cold cases. It showed that an unidentified perpetrator does not necessarily disappear simply because his DNA is absent from criminal databases. Family relationships can leave another path, but the technology also raised profound questions about privacy, consent, and the use of genetic information in criminal investigation. People who submit DNA for genealogical purposes may never imagine that their genetic data could help investigators identify a distant relative connected to a decades-old homicide. The Christine Jessup investigation became part of this emerging forensic landscape. It demonstrated both the extraordinary potential of the science and the complicated ethical questions surrounding it. Yet at the center of the debate was still a little girl whose family had waited for an answer since 1984. For them, the technology was not an abstract scientific development. It was the reason the name of the person responsible could finally be spoken. The case had traveled through missing person searches, a murder investigation, a wrongful conviction, an exoneration, decades of forensic uncertainty, and finally genetic genealogy. It had survived mistakes that could have buried the truth permanently. And when the evidence finally spoke clearly, it did something more than solve an old mystery. It corrected a story that had been wrong for years. Guy Paul Morin was not the killer. Calvin Hoover was identified as the man responsible. Christine Jessup was no longer a victim whose murder had no answer. But the case still carried a haunting reminder of what had been lost. 36 years is more than a number. It is an entire lifetime of waiting. And for Christine, there was no lifetime left to wait for. There was only the evidence she left behind, the family that remembered her, and the investigators who refused to let her murder disappear completely into the past. When Toronto police announced in October 2020 that Calvin Hoover had been identified as the person responsible for the DNA found in connection with Christine Jessup's murder, the case reached a conclusion few people could have imagined when the 9-year-old disappeared in 1984. But there was something unusual about the announcement. The name had finally been found, yet the man could not be arrested. Calvin Hoover had died in 2015. There would be no courtroom. No prosecutor would present the evidence to a jury. No defense attorney would challenge the genetic finding. No judge would pronounce a sentence. The investigation had reached an answer, but not through the traditional path of criminal justice. The evidence had done what investigators had spent decades trying to do. It had identified the person connected to the crime, but because Hoover was dead, the truth would have to exist without a trial. That distinction mattered. A police investigation can establish responsibility based on evidence, but a criminal conviction requires a prosecution and a judicial process. In Christine's case, that process was impossible. Toronto police, nevertheless, stated that if Hoover were alive, he would have been arrested and charged. The announcement brought an extraordinary chapter to an end, but it also forced the public to confront the strange reality of a solved homicide with no defendant standing before a judge. The case began on October 3rd, SIL 1984, when Christine Jessup disappeared after returning home from school. She was 9 years old. Her plan had been ordinary. She was expected to meet a friend at a nearby park. Instead, she vanished. The search began immediately. The community mobilized. Police tried to reconstruct her movements. Her family waited for news. For weeks, hope and fear existed side by side. Then, on December 31st, Christine's body was discovered in a farmer's field near Sunderland. The search had ended in tragedy. The investigation became a homicide case, and investigators began looking for the person responsible. One of the most important developments came when suspicion focused on Guy Paul Morin, a neighbor of the Jessup family. Morin was arrested and eventually convicted. For a time, the conviction appeared to provide an answer, but the answer was wrong. Morin maintained his innocence, and later DNA testing demonstrated that he was not the source of the biological evidence connected to the murder. His conviction was overturned in 1995. The case became a symbol of wrongful conviction in Canada. But for Christine's family, the exoneration of Morin did not solve the murder. It reopened it. The true killer was still free. The DNA evidence was now more important than ever because it represented a direct biological connection to the person responsible. Yet investigators faced a familiar problem. There was no direct match in the available criminal databases. The profile existed, but the name did not. The investigation could have remained frozen for another generation. Instead, new technology changed the search. Genetic genealogy allowed investigators to look for relatives of the unknown contributor. The technique had already demonstrated its ability to break open old cases by using family relationships hidden within genetic data. Investigators working on Christine's murder pursued the same possibility. They began with the DNA profile and searched for genetic connections. The resulting family tree eventually led them toward Calvin Hoover, but the genealogical lead was only the beginning. Investigators needed to determine whether Hoover fit the historical circumstances of the crime. He did. Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984. He had connections to the Jessup family through his wife. His family and Christine's family knew each other. According to investigators, Hoover had also participated in the search after Christine disappeared. Those details made the genetic lead particularly significant. Still, investigators needed direct confirmation. Hoover had died in 2015, but biological material associated with his autopsy remained available. Police obtained a DNA sample and compared it with the evidence connected to Christine's murder. The result confirmed the genetic genealogy lead. Hoover was the source of the DNA. The unknown contributor finally had an identity. The announcement in 2020 effectively closed the investigative mystery, but it could not provide the kind of ending people usually associate with a solved murder. There would be no arrest, no trial, no verdict, no sentence. The man investigators identified was already dead. This left Christine's family with a complicated form of closure. They had an answer, but not all the answers. They knew who investigators believed was responsible, but they could not ask him why. They could not hear his version of events. They could not confront him in court. They could not watch him accept responsibility or deny it. The evidence had spoken, but the person connected to it could no longer speak. That silence is one of the most haunting elements of the case. It also demonstrates why cold cases can be emotionally complicated even after they are solved. The public often imagines a solved case as a moment of complete resolution. A suspect is arrested. Evidence is presented. A verdict is reached. The family receives justice. But real investigations do not always end that way. Sometimes the suspect is already dead. Sometimes critical witnesses have died. Sometimes memories have faded. Sometimes physical evidence can identify a person but cannot answer every question. The Christine Jessup case contained all of those difficulties. It had crossed more than 3 decades. The original investigation had been compromised by a wrongful conviction. The innocent man had been exonerated. The real killer had remained unidentified. And when modern science finally revealed his identity, he was beyond prosecution. Still, the identification mattered profoundly. It established that the DNA associated with Christine's murder belonged to Hoover. It corrected the record. It confirmed that Morin had not been responsible. It gave Christine's family the answer they had waited decades to receive, and it demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving forensic evidence. The biological material had been collected decades before genetic genealogy existed. Nobody in 1984 could have known exactly how powerful that evidence might become. But investigators preserved it. That decision gave future investigators something to work with. The DNA profile became the bridge between 2 generations of forensic investigation. In one era, it was evidence that could not identify a suspect. In another, it became a pathway through a family tree. And eventually, it became a confirmed genetic link. The case, therefore, represents more than a murder solved through modern technology. It represents the long-term consequences of evidence preservation. It shows why a cold case should never be considered completely hopeless simply because conventional investigation has failed. Science evolves. Databases expand. Genetic methods improve. Investigative techniques change. What cannot be solved today may become solvable tomorrow. But the story also reveals a painful warning. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more difficult the eventual investigation can become. Witnesses disappear. Records are lost. People die. Memories change. Suspects may die before investigators identify them. The opportunity for direct justice can vanish even while the truth remains discoverable. That is exactly what happened with Hoover. Investigators eventually found him, but they found him after death. The evidence had survived. The suspect had not. For Christine's family, the timing was heartbreaking. They had spent decades without knowing who was responsible. When the answer finally arrived, it could not bring them the justice they might have imagined in 1984. It could only bring knowledge. Yet knowledge can still matter. The identification gave the family a name instead of an unknown person. It corrected the historical record. It allowed the case to be officially understood in a way that had been impossible for most of Christine's life, and it ensured that the man whose DNA was connected to the crime would no longer remain anonymous in the history of the investigation. The story also restored another truth that had been buried beneath the original prosecution. Guy Paul Morin was innocent. For years, his name had been associated with Christine's murder because of a conviction that later collapsed. His exoneration was essential, but the later identification of Hoover provided another layer of confirmation. The biological evidence that cleared Morin eventually pointed toward someone else. The case had not merely been unresolved, it had been misdirected. The real killer had remained beyond the reach of investigators while the wrong man faced the consequences. That is why the final identification carries such weight. It did not simply close a cold case, it corrected decades of misunderstanding. But even after the correction, one haunting truth remained. Christine's murder could be solved without ever being completely explained. Hoover could be identified without ever being questioned. The DNA could establish a connection without revealing every moment of the crime, and the family could receive an answer without receiving the full story. That is the strange ending of the Christine Jessup case. The mystery of identity was broken. The mystery of motive remained. The evidence had survived long enough to name the man. It had not survived in a form capable of telling everything else. And so the case entered history not as a perfect story of justice, but as something more complicated. A child murdered, an innocent man wrongly convicted, a killer identified decades later through genetic genealogy, and a family forced to accept an answer that arrived after the person responsible was already gone. The courtroom never heard the final evidence, but the evidence itself had finally spoken. Before Calvin Hoover's name entered the investigation, there was another name permanently attached to the Christine Jessup case: Guy Paul Morin. For years, Morin was presented as the man responsible for Christine's murder. His arrest created a sense of progress. His conviction created an apparent end, but that ending was false, and the consequences of that false conclusion would last for years. When DNA testing finally demonstrated that Morin was not the source of the biological evidence connected to Christine's murder, the case changed forever. It was no longer simply a search for a missing killer. It became a search for the truth after the justice system had already punished the wrong man. That distinction matters because the story of Christine Jessup cannot be understood only through the eventual identification of Calvin Hoover. It must also be understood through the years when the investigation moved in the wrong direction. Christine was 9 years old when she disappeared in 1984. Her family wanted answers. The community wanted answers. Police wanted a suspect. The pressure surrounding the case was enormous. A child had vanished, and then her body was found. Every day without an arrest intensified the public demand for progress. Investigators eventually focused on Morin, a neighbor whose circumstances placed him under suspicion. The case against him moved forward until he was convicted. But the conviction did not resolve the underlying evidence. The biological material connected to the murder remained a problem that would eventually destroy the prosecution's theory. Modern DNA testing gave investigators something the original investigation had lacked: a method capable of examining biological evidence with extraordinary specificity. The results excluded Morin. The man who had been convicted was not the person whose DNA was connected to the crime. His conviction was overturned in 1995. Suddenly, the apparent ending became another beginning. Christine was still dead, her killer was still unidentified, and Morin had to live with the consequences of being wrongly accused and imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. The case became a powerful example of how devastating an incorrect conclusion can be. A wrongful conviction does not simply disappear when a court overturns it. The years cannot be returned. Reputation cannot instantly be restored. The psychological consequences cannot be erased by a legal declaration. And while Morin was rebuilding his life, Christine's family still had no answer about who had actually killed their daughter. The investigation therefore carried to unresolved wounds. One involved an innocent man who had been punished. The other involved a murdered child whose killer remained free. The DNA evidence connected those two wounds. It had helped prove Morin's innocence, but it also contained information about the real perpetrator. The problem was that investigators could not yet interpret that information far enough to produce a name. The genetic profile was there. The direct match was not. For years, the unknown contributor remained exactly that. Unknown. The case entered the long, frustrating world of cold case investigation, where files remain open, but progress becomes increasingly difficult. The passage of time worked against investigators. People died, memories faded, communities changed, technology became outdated, but the DNA remained. That biological evidence became the most durable element of the entire investigation. It did not forget what happened. It did not change its genetic characteristics because decades passed. It waited for science to become capable of using it differently. That opportunity arrived with investigative genetic genealogy. The technique allowed investigators to approach the unknown DNA contributor through relatives rather than through a direct database match. It was a completely different way of thinking about identity. Traditional forensic investigation often asks whether the DNA belongs to someone already known to police. Genetic genealogy asks whether the DNA is connected to a family whose members may be identifiable through genealogical records and genetic databases. The search can begin with a distant relative and move toward the unknown contributor. In the Christine Jessup investigation, that approach eventually led investigators toward Calvin Hoover. The name was significant for reasons that extended beyond genetics. Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984. That meant investigators were not simply discovering an unfamiliar name at the end of a genetic search. They were rediscovering someone who had existed within the wider circle surrounding Christine's family. The revelation was disturbing, but investigators still needed direct confirmation. Genetic genealogy could identify a promising candidate. It could not replace the need for forensic testing. Hoover had died in 2015, but investigators obtained DNA from his autopsy material. The comparison with the biological evidence from Christine's murder confirmed the connection. The unknown contributor had finally been identified. Calvin Hoover was the man investigators held responsible for the DNA associated with the crime. The identification also changed the historical meaning of the Morin case. For years, the public had been forced to associate an innocent man's name with Christine's murder. Now, investigators could establish a different conclusion. Morin was not the source of the DNA. Hoover was. The scientific evidence had effectively rewritten the story, but the emotional consequences were impossible to erase. Morin had already lost years of his life. Christine's family had already spent decades waiting. Hoover had already died. There was no way to return to 1984 and correct the investigation before the damage occurred. This is one of the hardest realities of cold cases. Solving a case decades later does not mean the decades disappear. The truth can correct the record, but it cannot restore time. For Morin, the identification of Hoover meant that the name of the real suspect could finally replace the false association that had followed him. For Christine's family, it meant they no longer had to wonder whether the person responsible would ever be identified. But the answer came without the final confrontation that many families imagine. Hoover could not be questioned. He could not explain his action. He could not tell investigators whether he had followed the case after Christine's death or whether he had feared that the biological evidence would eventually expose him. Those questions belonged to the unknowable part of the story. What investigators could establish was narrower but powerful. The DNA associated with the murder matched Hoover. The genetic genealogy investigation had led to him. His circumstances were consistent with the investigation, and because he was dead, police stated that they would have arrested and charged him if he had been alive. That conclusion closed the investigative loop, But it did not close every emotional loop. Christine's family still had to live with what had happened to their daughter. Morin still had to live with what had happened to him. The community had to confront the fact that the person responsible had remained unidentified for more than 3 decades, and investigators had to acknowledge that the original investigation had failed in a profound way. Yet there was another lesson buried inside the tragedy. The case demonstrated why evidence preservation mattered. The biological evidence that eventually identified Hoover had been collected long before genetic genealogy existed. Nobody in 1984 could have known exactly what forensic technology would look like decades later. But because the evidence survived, future investigators had an opportunity that earlier investigators did not. The past had left behind a physical trace. The future learned how to read it. This is why cold cases can remain alive even when active investigation appears to have stopped. The case file may sit quietly, but science continues moving. A new database can create a new possibility. A new forensic method can change the meaning of old evidence. A new investigator can see a connection that previous investigators could not. Christine's case was transformed not because someone suddenly discovered a forgotten object, but because investigators found a new way to use evidence that had already existed for decades. The final identification therefore belonged to more than one generation. Investigators in 1984 collected evidence. Later, scientists used DNA testing to clear Morin. Genealogists and forensic specialists eventually used genetic genealogy to pursue the unknown contributor. Investigators then confirmed the resulting lead through direct DNA comparison. Each generation added another piece. No single person could have solved the case alone using the tools available at the beginning. It required time, preservation, and technological progress. And perhaps that is the most important reason Christine's story continues to resonate. The case demonstrates how dangerous certainty can become when evidence is incomplete, but it also demonstrates how powerful evidence can become when investigators refuse to let it disappear. The original certainty was wrong. The later science was able to correct it. Morin was innocent. Hoover was identified. Christine's murder finally had an investigative answer. But the years between those two conclusions cannot be erased. They remain part of the story. They are the years when a family waited, when an innocent man fought to clear his name, when investigators searched without knowing where the evidence would eventually lead, and when the real killer lived beyond the reach of the investigation. In the end, the DNA did more than identify a dead man. It restored a fundamental truth that had been obscured for decades. The person once convicted was not responsible. The person whose biological evidence had been preserved was finally identified, and Christine Jessup, the 9-year-old girl whose disappearance had started everything, was no longer at the center of a mystery without an answer. Her case had finally forced the past to confront the evidence it had left behind. For 36 years, the Christine Jessup investigation carried a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. Who was the man whose DNA had been left behind in connection with the murder of a 9-year-old girl? The question survived an investigation, a wrongful conviction, an exoneration, and decades of technological change. It survived because the evidence survived. And eventually, that evidence became something more than a clue. It became the foundation of an identification that would transform the case forever. By the time Toronto police announced the identification of Calvin Hoover in October 2020, the investigation had already passed through several different eras of forensic science. Each era had contributed something. The original investigators had collected evidence from the crime. Later forensic testing had helped establish that Guy Paul Morin was not responsible. Then genetic genealogy created a path toward the person whose DNA had remained unidentified. Finally, direct comparison with DNA associated with Hoover confirmed the connection. It was not one sudden discovery. It was decades of accumulated evidence, corrected assumptions, and scientific progress converging on the same point. But behind the technology was still the same unanswered human tragedy. Christine had been 9 years old. She had gone home from school on October 3rd, SIL 1984. She never returned to the ordinary life that should have followed. Her family had expected a child to come home, make plans, meet friends, and grow older. Instead, they entered a nightmare that would continue for decades. Her body was found on December 31st in a farmer's field near Sunderland. The search for a missing child had become a homicide investigation, and the person responsible disappeared into the uncertainty of the case. Investigators initially pursued Guy Paul Moran. He was eventually convicted, but DNA testing later established that the biological evidence did not come from him. His conviction was overturned in 1995. That moment should have marked the beginning of a new search for the real killer, but cold cases do not always move quickly. The investigators had a genetic profile, yet there was no direct match. The evidence could tell them that the person connected to it was not Moran, but it could not tell them his name. That limitation remained for years. Then the world of forensic investigation changed. Genetic genealogy introduced a new way of searching for unidentified perpetrators. The technique relied on one of the most fundamental facts of human genetics: relatives share genetic information. Even if an unknown person's DNA is absent from law enforcement databases, relatives may have genetic profiles available through genealogy databases. Investigators can potentially use those relationships to construct family trees and narrow the search toward an individual. But the process is not as simple as finding a surname and declaring the case solved. Genetic genealogy creates investigative leads. Those leads must then be tested against traditional evidence. Investigators need to determine whether a potential suspect could have been in the area, whether his age fits, whether his history fits, and whether direct DNA testing confirms the genetic connection. In Christine's case, the genealogical trail eventually led investigators to Calvin Hoover. Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984. He had connections to Christine's family through his wife. This was a critical detail because it meant the genetic lead had a real-world connection to the victim and her community. The name did not exist in isolation. It belonged to a man who had lived within the social environment surrounding the Jessup family. The investigation then faced a practical obstacle. Hoover had died in 2015. He could not be interviewed. He could not provide a voluntary sample. He could not be confronted with the evidence, but investigators were able to obtain DNA associated with his autopsy and compare it with the biological evidence from the murder. The result confirmed the connection. The unknown DNA contributor had been identified. The announcement was extraordinary because it answered a question that had remained unresolved since 1984. But it also created a strange kind of silence. The investigators finally had a name, yet the person who carried that name was no longer alive. There would be no interrogation. There would be no confession. There would be no explanation. There would be no opportunity to ask Hoover what happened to Christine or why. The forensic evidence could establish his connection to the biological material, but it could not reproduce the missing conversation that had disappeared with him. This is the boundary of modern forensic science. DNA can be incredibly powerful, but it cannot tell investigators everything. It can identify a biological source. It can establish relationships. It can connect evidence to a person, but it cannot automatically reveal motive. It cannot explain thought. It cannot restore memories that were never recorded. It cannot reconstruct every second of a crime. That limitation became especially painful in Christine's case because the investigation had already suffered from the consequences of uncertainty. An innocent man had been convicted. The actual killer had remained unidentified. The family had spent decades without knowing who was responsible. And when the answer finally arrived, the man investigators identified was already dead. Yet the identification still mattered. It corrected the historical record. It gave investigators a basis for stating who was responsible for the DNA associated with the crime. It also reinforced the fact that Moran had been wrongly convicted. His exoneration had established that he was not the source of the biological evidence. The later identification of Hoover provided the other side of that forensic equation. If Moran was excluded and Hoover matched, the investigation could finally explain where the biological evidence led. The case had moved from an incorrect answer to no answer, and finally, to a forensic identification. That journey illustrates the strange power of evidence preserved across generations. The evidence collected in 1984 was not created for the technology of 2020. It simply survived long enough to benefit from it. Investigators working decades earlier could not have known that genetic genealogy would eventually become a tool in homicide investigations. They could not have predicted the databases, algorithms, and genealogical methods that would emerge, but they preserved evidence. That decision created a possibility for the future. The Christine Jessup case demonstrates why that mattered. A cold case is not necessarily an empty case. Sometimes it is a case containing evidence whose full potential has not yet been discovered. The years may make investigation more difficult, but they do not necessarily destroy every path to the truth. In Christine's case, the path remained hidden inside a biological trace. The evidence survived while memories changed and people aged. It survived while investigators retired and technology evolved. It survived while the person responsible lived and eventually died. Then, years after his death, the evidence finally connected him to the crime. The timing was extraordinary. Hoover died in 2015. Investigators identified him in 2020. The man had escaped a courtroom not because the evidence failed, but because time had already removed him from the legal process. That reality prevented the conventional form of justice, but it did not prevent identification. Toronto police stated that had Hoover been alive, he would have been arrested and charged. The department's conclusion therefore depended on evidence strong enough to support that investigative determination. The family finally had a name, but they still had to live with everything the name could not explain. They could not ask why. They could not hear an apology. They could not watch the person responsible face a judge. They could not recover the years that had been lost. The identification could not change the past. What it could do was prevent the past from remaining falsely understood. Christine's murder would no longer be a case in which the wrong man carried the historical burden. It would no longer be a mystery without an identified perpetrator. The evidence had finally established a direction, and that direction had begun with something incredibly small: biological material left behind during a crime more than 3 decades earlier. That tiny trace had outlived the investigation that first collected it. It had outlived the suspect's anonymity. It had outlived the suspect himself. Eventually, it became the most important voice in the case. There is something haunting about that idea. Human beings forget. Communities change. Files become old. Memories fade. But DNA does not care how much time passes. It remains a record of biological identity. If preserved properly and interpreted with appropriate scientific methods, it can wait. And Christine's evidence waited for 36 years. It waited through the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin. It waited through his exoneration. It waited through years without a database match. It waited until genetic genealogy provided another route. And finally, it led investigators to Calvin Hoover. The case had not been solved by a dramatic confession or a sudden witness. It had been solved by persistence, by preservation, by science, by investigators willing to return to an old question and ask it differently. That is why the Christine Jessup investigation remains so powerful. It is not simply a story about a killer who was eventually identified. It is a story about how the truth can remain hidden without disappearing. The evidence was there all along. The world simply had to catch up with it. And when it finally did, the silence surrounding Christine's murder was broken not by the voice of the man responsible, but by the evidence he left behind. The identification of Calvin Hoover answered the question that had haunted investigators for more than 3 decades, but it did not answer everything. In fact, once the name was finally known, another layer of uncertainty became impossible to ignore. Who was Christine Jessup's killer? Investigators now had an answer. But what happened to Christine during those final hours? Why was she targeted? What was the sequence of events that led from an ordinary afternoon in 1984 to a crime that would remain unsolved for more than 30 years? Those questions were never given the same certainty as the DNA identification, and perhaps they never could be. Hoover was dead. The opportunity to question him had disappeared years before investigators knew his name. The evidence could connect him to the biological material. It could reconstruct a genetic relationship. It could establish an investigative conclusion, but it could not make the dead speak. That silence became the final mystery of the Christine Jessup case. Christine was 9 years old when she disappeared on October 3rd, Sill 1984. She had returned home from school. She was supposed to meet a friend. It was an ordinary day, interrupted by something nobody around her could have predicted. Her disappearance immediately transformed the atmosphere around her family. The search began with hope. People wanted to believe she would be found alive. Police investigated her movements. Neighbors became part of the search. Questions spread through the community. Every possible explanation had to be considered, but as the hours became days and the days became weeks, the fear became harder to escape. Christine was not simply missing. Something had happened to her. On December 31st, her body was discovered in a farmer's field near Sunderland. The discovery ended the uncertainty about whether she was alive, but it created a much darker question: who had killed her? The investigation that followed would eventually focus on Guy Paul Morin. Morin became the man accused of committing the crime. His conviction created the appearance of resolution, but the appearance was false. DNA evidence later proved that he was not responsible. His conviction was overturned in 1995. The exoneration exposed a devastating failure. The wrong man had been convicted while the real killer remained free. Yet the same biological evidence that cleared Morin also preserved a path toward the actual perpetrator. For years, that path seemed to lead nowhere. The DNA profile existed, but investigators had no direct match. The unknown contributor remained anonymous. The case became one of those investigations that seemed destined to remain unresolved forever. Then genetic genealogy changed the equation. Instead of asking whether the unknown DNA belonged to someone already known to police, investigators began searching for genetic relatives. The strategy was fundamentally different. It treated the DNA not only as evidence of identity, but as evidence of family connection. A relative could lead to a family tree. A family tree could lead to a potential suspect. And a potential suspect could then be tested directly. The process eventually led to Calvin Hoover. The significance of his name was intensified by his connection to Christine's family. Hoover had been 28 years old at the time of the murder. His wife had a relationship with Christine's mother. The families were connected. According to investigators, Hoover had also participated in the search for Christine after she disappeared. That detail is particularly disturbing because it places him within the community response to the very crime investigators later connected to him. The man identified decades later was not someone who existed entirely outside Christine's world. He had a connection to people who knew her. He was close enough to be part of the surrounding social environment, yet nobody could see what the DNA would eventually reveal. That is one of the most unsettling features of cold cases. The truth may exist in plain sight while the evidence needed to recognize it remains unavailable. In 1984, investigators did not have the tools they would later use. In the years that followed, the case was shaped by the wrongful conviction of Morin. By the time genetic genealogy became available, Hoover was already dead. He had died in 2015. Investigators therefore had to work backward through the evidence he left behind. DNA obtained from his autopsy material was compared with the biological evidence from Christine's murder. The result confirmed the genealogical lead. Hoover's DNA matched the evidence. Toronto police announced the identification in 2020. Police stated that Hoover was responsible for the DNA sample found on Christine's underwear and considered him responsible for the murder. If he had still been alive, investigators said, he would have been arrested and charged. But there would be no arrest. There would be no trial. The final questions would remain unanswered. That absence of a courtroom is important because a trial often provides a public reconstruction of a crime. Investigators present their evidence. Witnesses explain what they know. Prosecutors establish a timeline. Defense attorneys challenge the evidence. Jurors evaluate the competing arguments. The process can expose details that never emerge during an ordinary investigation. In Christine's case, none of that could happen. Hoover could not be questioned. No jury would hear his explanation. No prosecutor would ask him where he had been. No defense attorney would challenge the allegations in his presence. The identification, therefore, had to stand on the forensic evidence and the investigative work surrounding it. It was a conclusion without the traditional final act of a criminal prosecution. For Christine's family, that must have created a complicated form of closure. Knowing the identity of the man investigators believed responsible was enormously significant. But knowing his name could not answer every question they had carried since 1984. There would never be a complete explanation for why Christine's life had ended. There would never be a conversation with the person responsible. There would never be an apology. There would never be a courtroom moment in which the full story was forced into the public record. The family received something precious, but incomplete: the truth about identity. That distinction is crucial when discussing cold cases. Solving a case does not always mean solving every mystery surrounding it. Sometimes investigators can establish who was responsible without knowing exactly why. Sometimes science can identify a person without reconstructing every detail of the crime. Sometimes the evidence can correct a wrongful conviction without restoring the years lost because of it. Christine's case contained all of these realities at once. Guy Paul Morin was innocent. Calvin Hoover was identified through genetic evidence. Christine's family finally had an answer, yet nothing could change what happened in 1984. Nothing could return Christine to her family. Nothing could restore the years that disappeared between her death and the eventual identification of the man investigators believed responsible. The passage of time had created another tragedy. By the time science caught up with the evidence, the person who could have provided the missing narrative was gone. This is why the case remains haunting even after its identification. A solved case can still contain darkness. It can still contain unanswered questions. It can still leave investigators staring at the evidence and wondering what they will never know. And perhaps the most painful unanswered question is the simplest one. Why did it take so long? The answer lies partly in the limitations of forensic science, partly in the mistakes of the original investigation, partly in the absence of a direct DNA match, and partly in the passage of time. But there is another element that cannot be ignored. The real perpetrator remained outside the reach of the investigation for decades. He lived while the case became history. He aged while Christine remained 9 years old, forever in the memory